Hey guys, tonight we begin with something so deliciously unpleasant, it might just knock you out cold medieval cuisine. Picture this, you've stumbled into a smoky, soot-covered kitchen somewhere in a stone cottage that leaks in all directions. There's no menu, no seasoning drawer, and certainly no complaints department. Instead, you're greeted by a pot of something vaguely brown bubbling with a level of menace usually reserved for villain origin stories. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where meals were more about survival than satisfaction, and where dinner often tasted like smoke, ash and regret. You probably won't survive this, not without your modern stomach staging a full-blown protest. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling extra cozy, drop your location and the time you're watching this. I love seeing where and when you all tune in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you is the smoke. Not the cozy, woodsy scent of a campfire marshmallow roast. No, this is the eye-watering, throat-scraping kind that makes you question your life choices. In the heart of every medieval kitchen is a wide-open hearth. There's no chimney, not yet. Just a hole in the ceiling if you're lucky, or none at all if you're not. The smoke curls, floats and settles where it pleases your hair, your cloak, your bread. You get used to coughing between bites. The fire's been burning for days, maybe weeks. Every dish passes through this blackened hearth like some smoky rite of passage. Your stew boiled in soot-slicked iron. Your bread baked near embers, but also near yesterday's ashes. That pleasant charcoal note, it's not seasoning, it's residue. Even the pot itself is suspect. The iron is rough-crusted with the ghost of meals past, and handled with cloth rags that may or may not have once been someone's sleeve. You settle onto a low stool that wobbles dramatically. It's dim. Your only light flickers from the fire itself, casting everything in sepia and shadow. A woman with soot-smudged cheeks ladles something into a wooden bowl for you. It's brown. It's just brown. No hints of green, red, or even beige. Just brown. You brace yourself. It tastes like smoke ash, and something that might once have been a vegetable. Maybe. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person preferred smoky flavours, or simply didn't notice them anymore. After years of eating food from the same fire pit, the line between flavour and haze likely disappeared. There's no word for barbecue here. This isn't cuisine, it's just eating. And yet this meal, harsh, unfiltered, mildly despairing, is a privilege. Many wouldn't have even that. Mainstream history often focuses on feasts and banquets, but the average medieval kitchen was humble, humble, humble. The kitchen might have been a corner of a single-room house, or outside, or just a fire pit beside a shed. There were no timers, no measuring cups, just instinct, passed down knowledge, and lots of stirring. The goal: don't burn it too much. A quirky detail: many households reused cooking water across multiple meals. That means your turnip soup may contain traces of last night's fish and the afternoon's barley mush. It's like a slow-motion smoothie, only hot, and definitely not Instagrammable. Above you, strips of something vaguely meaty hang from the beams. It's unclear whether they're drying curing or just forgotten. A hen walks by your foot, looking offended. She probably knows what's in the stew. No one washes their hands before cooking. Water is precious, and usually full of suspicious floaty things. Your cook might wipe her fingers on her apron, or helpfully on the dog. Cutlery is limited. A communal spoon if you're lucky. Otherwise it's hands-on, greasy and unapologetic. You glance at the walls. They're streaked with soot and fat. Some homes have a spit for roasting meat, but it's usually the domain of children. Yes, kids spent hours slowly turning a crank so a chicken didn't roast unevenly. Medieval rotisserie powered by bored 8-year-olds. Sometimes to clean the hearth, cooks would burn bundles of aromatic herbs over it. That sounds charming. Until you realise the herbs are mostly dried weeds, and the scent fades under layers of embedded bacon grease. If you're high-born, you might get cinnamon in your porridge. If you're low-born, you get ash in your ale. It builds character. Despite everything, there's a strange coziness. The fire glows. The room hums with soft activity. People talk chew grunt. Dogs steal crumbs. Babies nap by the warmth. It's not joyful, but it's honest. This is survival every single day, and food, even food that tastes like the inside of a chimney, is life. So you finish your bowl. The smoky flavour clings to your tongue. Your eyes water. Your lungs are negotiating a walkout. But hey, you're fed. And in medieval times, that's victory enough. You haven't even digested the soot stew when someone offers you bread. At first you feel hopeful. Maybe it'll offset the ash. Maybe it'll be soft and warm and vaguely familiar. Maybe it'll taste like, well, bread. It won't. What you're handed looks like bread, smells like bread, and cracks like a clay tile. The crust is jagged enough to threaten dental insurance if that existed. You tug at it and something crunches, not in a flaky croissant way, but in a did I just eat gravel way. Congratulations. You've just met medieval bread. Bread was the lifeblood of medieval diets. For rich and poor alike, it showed up at nearly every meal. But not all loaves were created equal. For nobles, there were soft white wheaten breads, airy and finely sifted. For everyone else, there was maslin, a rough mixture of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else hadn't moulded in the corner bin. Some of it was ground with stones, leaving behind surprise pebbles in the flour. That wasn't just texture, it was dental warfare. Historians still argue whether millers added sand and grit to bulk up their flour intentionally, or if it was simply a byproduct of primitive grinding stones. Either way, by your third bite, you're starting to understand why medieval skeletons show so many worn-down molars. But that's not even the strangest part. The bread you're chewing might not have been made for eating. It could be a trencher, a thick stale slab meant to double as a plate. Soups, stews, and roasted things were dumped right on top, and the bread underneath soaked it all up like a sponge. If you were lucky, you got to eat the trencher. If you were less lucky, it was fed to the dogs or the local poor. This is the only era where being served after the meal meant you might still be hungry and holding a gravy-flavoured sponge. And let's talk about freshness. Bread wasn't baked daily for most families. That's a luxury. Instead, it was made in big batches and stored in cloth or just on a shelf near the fire where it quietly petrified. By day 4, it required serious jaw strength. By day 6, it doubled as a weapon. Still, bread mattered. It was sacred, symbolic, and often the only thing standing between a person and hunger. Monasteries baked it for the needy. Families traded it. Entire economies turned on the value of flour. You may not enjoy chewing it, but you respect it somewhere between admiration and reluctant fear. Here's a quirky little tangent. Some bakers were so infamous for cutting corners, adding chalk or mashed beans to stretch dough, that laws were passed to monitor their loaves. The assize of bread, yes, that was a real law, regulated everything from size to price. Bakers caught cheating could be publicly shamed-whipped or put in the pillory, with their subpar bread hung around their neck. There were even bread tasters in some towns, appointed officials, whose job was to take a bite of communal loaves and declare whether they were worthy of consumption. Imagine applying for that position, guaranteed jaw pain, daily grit, and a real risk of accidental poisoning. By now, you've gnawed your way through half your loaf. You feel full, but not in a satisfying way. More like emotionally defeated. Your mouth is dry. Your teeth hurt. Your soul has questions. You eye the fire again. Maybe more stew will help, or maybe not. Outside, the smell of yeast and smoke lingers in the fog. Someone is baking in a communal oven today, a luxury reserved for those who didn't own their own hearths. The oven's located at the edge of the village near the stream that sometimes runs, and sometimes just sulks. People wait their turn, chatting, adjusting bundles, trying not to inhale too much soot. The oven itself looks like a hobbit hut made of stone. It holds the heat with all the grace of a blast furnace. Inside loaves bake side by side, sometimes touching, sometimes burning on one side and doughy on the other. No timers, no thermometers, just intuition and a quick hand, and if your bread caught fire, well, ash adds flavour. Right back at your wobbly stool you glance at what's left. A pile of crumbs, a smear of something you hope was butter, though that might be wishful thinking. You scrape it up with your crust and take a final bite. It cracks again. Somewhere in the distance a pig squeals, probably in envy that you still have teeth. But hey, you're not hungry anymore, or at least you're not as hungry as before. You've joined a long, aching tradition of people who survived on flower fire and sheer willpower. And honestly, the bread wasn't the worst part. Just when you think your jaw might forgive you for the bread, someone ladles another dish into your wooden bowl, a murky, bubbling stew. It's thick, brownish grey and steaming. No one tells you what's in it, which in this century is a red flag wrapped in a turnip peel. You take a breath. The smell isn't awful earthy, maybe a bit tangy, but there's a hint of something you can't quite place. Like rain-drenched moss. Or sadness. You brace yourself and take a spoonful. It's chewy, soft in places, fibrous in others. A chunk of something that might be carrot floats by looking vaguely haunted. You chew slowly. It's warm filling and completely impossible to identify. Welcome to peasant stew, also known as pottage. This was the go-to meal for millions of medieval people across Europe. It was a constant pot of bubbling whatever you've got left on the fire for days at a time. New ingredients were added as available. Old bits broke down into mush. It was slow food by necessity, not design. And yes, it often contained dirt. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of things like roots, bark and twigs was intentional or just the result of washing ingredients in muddy water. Either way, you're almost certainly eating something that once lived underground, and maybe a few things that still do. The vegetables are rarely fresh. They're from storage pits, slightly soft and often sprouting. Cabbage shows up frequently because it keeps well and no one can smell much over the ever-present smoke anyway. You might get onion leeks or turnips if it's a good season. Potatoes, not yet. Those poor tubers won't arrive until the Columbian Exchange hundreds of years from now. For now it's roots and leaves and hope. Protein in this stew is complicated. If your household kept animals, maybe there's a bit of pork fat or a slice of dried sausage floating around. More likely it's beans. Lots and lots of beans. Lentils, peas, chickpeas, any legume that could be grown, dried and reanimated by boiling. And yet despite everything, the stew has a kind of rustic charm. It warms your belly. It fills the corners. It makes your bones feel less hollow, even if it tastes like mud and memory. Quirky fact, in some regions, peasant stews included a dish known as perpetual pottage. The idea was simple, never empty the pot. Just keep adding ingredients over time, creating an eternal soup that may have included bits from weeks ago. The longer it stewed, the more flavours it absorbed, and the more mysterious it became. A culinary time capsule, complete with floating barley and the occasional rogue feather. You're not sure how long you've been chewing the same bite. Texture-wise, this meal is a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Some parts dissolve, others fight back. You found a sliver of bone, possibly chicken, possibly not. You gently set it aside and carry on. This isn't a meal you rush. It's a slow, meditative process, like chewing the concept of nourishment itself. Your hosts are polite. No one asks what you think of the flavour. That would imply it matters. Here food is fuel. You need it to plough to carry to survive the endless drizzle and the ever-hungry winter. Taste is secondary to calories, and in most cases entirely optional. Still you manage a smile. It's edible. You're alive. That's what counts. Off in the corner, a boy stirs another pot, a thinner version, likely gruel for the younger kids or the elderly. It's oats or barley simmered until it becomes glue-like. He uses a wooden paddle as long as his arm. Occasionally, he sneaks a sip, burning his tongue and pretending not to care. You can't blame him. Historians often debate how often meat made it into these pots. Some argue it was rare to the point of mythical. Others believe small game like rabbits, pigeons, or even frogs found their way in more often than we assume. Either way, if there's meat in your bowl tonight, it's a special occasion. Celebrate, accordingly. Just don't try to identify it too closely. You find a bit of something chewy. Not bad, not good, just there. It could be mushroom, could be old parsnip, could be squirrel. You decide not to ask. Outside, the weather changes. Rain taps on the thatched roof like a drummer losing interest. Inside, the heat of the hearth and the belly full of stew make your eyelids heavier. Someone yawns. A dog stretches near the fire. A spoon clatters to the floor, ignored. For a fleeting moment you feel peaceful, not full exactly, but warm, grounded, safe, even if dinner tasted like compost in a clay bowl. Just as your stomach settles into an uneasy truce with the stew, someone pulls a fresh dessert from the oven. Or rather a burnt and crumbling object that used to have ambitions of being a pie. It's handed to you proudly still hot, its crust blackened on one edge and strangely damp on the other. You nod graciously, because what else can you do? Welcome to the not-so-great medieval bake-off. Medieval baking was equal parts hope, guesswork and luck. There were no dials, no timers, and definitely no great British judges offering comforting hugs. The oven was a stone or clay dome, heated with woods, and scraped clean mostly before baking began. You tested the heat with your hand, your elbow, or sometimes just by tossing in a pinch of flour and seeing what happened. Results varied wildly. The pie you've been handed appears to have been a meat pie once, possibly pork or maybe pigeon, maybe both. The crust, while valiant in structure, has taken on the texture of pottery. You bite in and immediately realise that what you're tasting isn't filling, it's ash. Not ash flavoured, actual ash. Historians still argue whether ash in baking was entirely accidental or a misunderstood side effect of communal ovens. These ovens were shared by entire villages, and if someone didn't fully clear the embers, or if a lazy baker shoved their pie in too early, the bottom crust would absorb the flavour of last week's firewood. The result pies with the delightful undertone of fireplace. You chew carefully. The crust cracks, then yields to something surprisingly soft inside. It's hard to tell what it is, but you can detect hints of lard, dried herbs and regret. A bone fragment grazes your tongue. You gently spit it into your sleeve and pretend nothing happened. Now, baking wasn't just about pies. Bread loaves, pastries, even tarts made their way into these ovens. The wealthier the household, the more variety. Rich folks had pies stuffed with venison dates, even fish. Yes, fish pie was a thing. Poorer families focused on pasties or hand pies made with root vegetables and hard-earned dreams. Quirky fact pie crusts weren't always meant to be eaten. Sometimes they were just containers, thick, inedible shells called coffins that held fillings during baking. You sliced off the lid, scooped out the contents, and discarded the shell like a medieval to-go box. You imagine the disappointment of biting into a beautiful-looking pastry only to realise the crust was tougher than your boot. Then again, if you were hungry enough, the boot might be a tempting alternative. Bakers were often both feared and relied upon in medieval towns. Their ovens could burn down half a village if unattended. Yet they also kept the community fed. The best bakers earned reputations, drew loyal customers, and were sometimes even bribed to bake extra loaves when shortages loomed. The worst ones, well, they were called out by name during sermons. Your host proudly offers you a second slice. You decline with a polite grimace. They shrug and eat it themselves, biting through the scorched crust like it's nothing. Maybe they've just built up calluses on their gums. As the pie disappears, a sweet scent wafts from a pan near the coals. Could it be something sugary, sort of? A dish called frumenti simmers away a kind of wheat porridge cooked with milk and sweetened if sugar was available with a pinch of honey or dried fruit. It's holiday food reserved for feast days and religious festivals. Tonight must be special. You're handed a small bowl. It's warm, soft, slightly grainy but not bad. For a moment you think, this is it. This is the best it gets. Then you bite into a whole clove. Not chewed, not ground, just clove. A whole floral grenade. Your eyes water gently. Historians often debate the medieval palate. Did people like their food, this bland, this burnt, this unpredictable? Or did they simply get used to it? Spices were rare, expensive, and often used more for show than taste. Sugar was a luxury imported in tiny amounts. The average pie, if it made it to the table unburned and recognisable, was cause for celebration. Outside the window, the sky darkens. The day fades into soot and smoke. Someone stirs the embers again, scraping old crusts from the hearthstone. A dog licks the edges of a dropped tart and looks vaguely proud. You lean back against the wall a bit, pie-sick, but strangely grateful. There's something comforting in the effort, the shared meal, the warmth, even the burnt edges. The pie may have tasted like charcoal and sorrow, but it was made with care, or at least with fire. And honestly, that's the medieval standard. Your tongue is still coated in the clove-flavoured aftermath of dessert when someone offers you a drink. You accept with cautious optimism. Surely a nice cold cup of water will help wash away the ash soot and pastry regrets clinging to your molars. Bad idea. You bring the wooden cup to your lips and catch a whiff of something. Grainy, a little sour, a little earthy. It's not water, it's small ale, a weak, barely alcoholic beer brewed at home, and it's room temperature, naturally. Welcome to medieval hydration. Drinking plain water in this era was a gamble. Wells were shallow, rivers doubled as both bath and latrine. Rainwater caught in barrels was unpredictable. So people turned to fermentation, even children, even monks, even your great-great-great peasant grandma. If it frothed, fizzed, or tasted vaguely alive, it was probably safer than the village well. Small ale was brewed fast and consumed faster. It wasn't about getting drunk though, that certainly happened. It was about killing bacteria and staying hydrated. Your cup may only have a sliver of alcohol, but that's enough to fend off waterborne diseases. Probably. Historians still argue whether people really avoided water altogether, or if the dangers have been slightly exaggerated over time. Some suggest folks in cleaner rural areas drank water regularly, while urban centres full of waste animals and mystery puddles leaned heavily on beer and wine. Either way, you sip again and try not to picture what would happen if you drank from the town stream. The taste, flat, warm, faintly musty like someone dropped bread into it 3 days ago and then forgot. Which honestly they probably did. For wealthier households, wine or mead might be available especially in monasteries or noble homes. But even those weren't the sweet, smooth drinks you're used to. Medieval wine was sharp tannic, and sometimes flavoured with herbs or spices to hide the fact that it had turned. Mead could be sickly sweet or strangely sour depending on the honey, the water, and how distracted the brewer was that week. A quirky tidbit, some people added bread crusts, herbs, or even egg whites to their drinks as a kind of primitive filtration. It didn't do much, but hey, it's the effort that counts. In some areas, people brewed their own beverages in small batches daily. Entire households operated like microbreweries, minus the beards and branding. The lady of the house might brew ale every few days, storing it in wooden casks by the fire. Over time, the barrels picked up flavours from the smoke from the wood, from yesterday's turnip soup splash. Complex notes, let's say. You finish your ale with a grimace that you hope no one sees. Your throat feels slightly cleaner, your stomach slightly fuller, but your taste buds are writing a formal complaint. Someone else passes you another cup this time, a thinner, almost clear liquid. Could it be water? Nope. It's vinegar and herbs. Possibly posset, or some form of sour tisane. People in the Middle Ages were big on restoratives. Drinks that sounded medicinal, tasted questionable, and were believed to balance the body's humours. If it made your face scrunch, it was probably doing something good. You look around. Children drink small ale like juice boxes. Elders sip mead from cracked mugs. No one blinks, no one gags. No one gags. You're very clearly the soft one in this room. And yet, there's something almost comforting in the ritual. In the way drinks are passed cups, shared mugs refilled. In the warmth of the firelight flickering off pewter and wood. You feel included, soothed, even if your taste buds have gone into hiding. Still, you can't help but imagine how much trouble a single Brita filter would save this entire village. Outside, the night deepens. The communal well gurgles somewhere in the dark, full of frogs, mystery eels, and maybe someone's lost sock. You're suddenly thankful for your musty cup of ale. At least it's not swimming with surprises. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve. It tastes like barley smoke and fermented guesswork. But it's over. You survived medieval refreshment, and you didn't even have to boil a single frog. Somewhere a drunk monk snores into his wine barrel. You salute him silently. By now, your stomach has given up sending protest signals. It's just along for the ride. And as the evening meal winds down, someone brings out a slab of something. Meat adjacent. It's hard. It's shiny. It makes a distinct thud when placed on the table. You eye it warily. Welcome to the world of preserved meats, also known as the reason why chewing was a full-body workout in the Middle Ages. This particular piece appears to be salted pork. Thick, greyish, and stiff as a roof tile. You try cutting it with a knife. Nothing happens. You press harder. The knife slides off like you're trying to slice granite. So you do what everyone else does, you gnaw, and gnaw, and gnaw. Salting was the medieval answer to refrigeration, or rather the lack of it. Meat was packed in layers of salt, sometimes smoked first, and stored in barrel cellars or hanging from the rafters like prehistoric chandeliers. It could last for weeks, even months. Whether it should last that long was a separate issue entirely. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had regular access to preserved meats, or if these tough treasures were reserved for soldiers, seafarers, and folks lucky enough to own a pig. What's clear is, this salt was power. Salt preserved life, flavoured gruel, and even paid wages in some places. It wasn't just seasoning, it was currency defence and miracle cure all in one. And boy did it overstay its welcome in your mouth. The pork is so salty your lips pucker involuntarily. Your tongue dries up mid-bite. You instinctively reach for a drink and remember, oh right, it's vinegar, tea, or warm beer. You chew, slowly, painfully, like you're being punished for a sin you don't remember committing. Salted beef likewise was tough as saddle leather. Soldiers carried it, travellers packed it, and entire navies survived on it. To prepare it, you often had to soak it overnight, then boil it, then hope. Right now you're not sure any of that happened to the meat you're attempting to eat. It tastes like iron filings and regret. Quirky fact, in some regions fish was preserved in salt and became the stuff of culinary nightmares. Cod, herring and eels were salted until they resembled ancient relics. The infamous stockfish was dried to the point of becoming weapon grade. Some households soaked it for days to make it chewable again. You don't even want to imagine what it was like before soaking. In noble households, salt-preserved delicacies were a status symbol. They imported exotic fish, pickled fruits, and meats cured with special blends of spices if they could afford them. The poor meanwhile made do with what they had, which often meant meat so salty it could season an entire village. You manage to gnaw off a strip. Your jaw creaks like an old drawbridge. A few villagers notice and nod in approval. You're fitting in now. Salt stains your lips. Your eyes water slightly. Your mouth may never be the same, but socially, you've arrived. You try a piece of smoked meat next. It's darker, stringier, and somehow tastes more like chimney than pork. Smoking was the other great preservation method of the era. Meats were hung over hearths for weeks sometimes in separate smokehouses and infused with layers of woody flavour. Unfortunately, in practice, this meant a permanent scent of burnt pine and beef jerky gone rogue. Sometimes smoking and salting were combined for maximum preservation and minimal chewability. Soldiers in winter monks in fasting season and tired mothers trying to stretch one ham across 4 children and a goat, this was survival food. Flavour was an afterthought. Texture was a test of character. You try to swallow. It doesn't go down easily. Your throat feels like it's been lightly sandblasted. You chase it with a gulp of small ale. Mistake. Now your mouth tastes like smoked barley and pickled bacon. And yet, there's pride here. This meat may be unforgiving, but it's lasting. It won't rot. It won't attract rats. It can be hidden in cellars wrapped in cloth, traded, shared, fought over. In a world without refrigerators, it's basically a miracle. You wipe your lips and glance at the slab still sitting on the table. It hasn't changed. Still shiny, still defiant. You nod at it with newfound respect. Somewhere in the house, a cured sausage swings from the ceiling beam. It twirls gently, menacingly. Outside, the moon is rising. A dog gnaws a bone with effortless dedication. You envy him. You stretch your jaw. You survive the saltiest course. Barely. You've barely recovered from your encounter with the salt brick pork when the conversation around you turns serious. Not about war or weather, but about Wednesday. Someone else mutters something about fish. Ah, yes. You've walked headlong into church-ruled dining, a labyrinth of fasts, feasts, and food-based guilt. In medieval Europe, the church didn't just govern your afterlife, it also took a very active interest in your dinner plate. What you ate when you ate it, and how indulgent it was, all carefully measured, weighed, and judged. Fasting wasn't just for Lent. It happened often. Wednesdays, Fridays, all 40 days before Easter. Saints' days, days before Saints' days. Basically, if you had a craving for butter, the calendar would almost always disappoint you. Tonight, it's Friday, which means no meat. You glance guiltily at the pork rind still stuck between your molars. Whoops! But the folks here are used to it. They shrug offer you a clay dish of pottage with barley and dried peas and mutter that the saints will understand. Still, the rules are taken seriously, especially by monks, nobles, and those with reputations to maintain. You can't flaunt a roasted goose on a holy day without consequences. Historians still argue whether the fasting rules were strictly enforced at the village level, or more of an aspirational standard. For the clergy and elite, penalties were real public penance fines, or for serial offenders, exclusion from communion. For peasants, though, life often won out. If your only food was a meat stew on a fast day, well, you'd say an extra prayer and eat it anyway. So what did people eat on these meatless days, Fish? So much fish. Salted fish, dried fish, pickled fish, fish pies, fish porridge. In landlocked villages, this was less a menu and more a creative writing challenge. Some people walked miles to find fresh fish. Others traded with peddlers. The lucky ones lived near rivers or coasts. The unlucky ones choked down mummified herring with a side of spiritual discipline. And here's a bizarre historical workaround. Beaver tails were considered acceptable. You heard that right. Because beavers lived in water and had scaly tails, church officials deemed them fish adjacent. So you could eat a beaver tail on a fast day without divine consequences. Tasty? Probably not. But the theological logic was in its own way brilliant. Quirky tidbit barnacle geese. Yes, actual birds were also considered fish by some medieval scholars. Why? Because it was believed they hatched from driftwood or barnacles in the sea. This allowed pious diners to enjoy roast goose on fasting days with no spiritual guilt. Today we'd call that creative taxonomy. The rules were so layered, many households kept calendars or hired clerics to advise them on permissible meals. Butter not during Lent. Eggs. Only if they were from ducks sometimes. Milk depends on the feast. Bread only unleavened on specific holidays. If you're confused, don't worry, so are they. Tonight the household serves you a Lenten pottage. It's a watery barley gruel with wild herbs and a few limp vegetables. The cook added a drizzle of oil for richness, but there's no meat, no dairy, no joy. You chew and nod politely. It tastes like boiled hay and hard times. And yet people find ways to celebrate. On feast days when the rules lift, tables overflow with meats, pastries, cheeses and wine. It's a release valve for the soul, a reward for all those weeks of blandness, and also a reminder that indulgence is fleeting. You take another bite. Someone breaks the silence with a joke about a bishop who once fainted at the smell of bacon during Lent. Everyone laughs. The church might control the rules, but it doesn't control the kitchen entirely. Outside, bells toll from a distant chapel. Night settles in layers like ash on a cooling hearth. You stare at your bowl of fishless, meatless, dairyless mush and remind yourself it's all part of the rhythm. Feast, fast, chew, pray. You swish some weak ale around your mouth to chase down the pottage. It helps? Barely. Somewhere nearby a monk is eating boiled leeks by candlelight. He looks serene, or maybe just resigned. You're still processing the beaver tail thing. You decide to stretch your legs, hoping to walk off the salt soot, an existential dread left behind by the beaver tail loophole. But the moment you step away from the hearth, the smell hits you again, stronger now. Thick, layered, indescribable. A cocktail of old grease-burnt wood, boiled cabbage, damp wool, and faintly rancid fat. Medieval kitchens didn't just cook food, they became the food. The walls absorbed it. The air wore it like perfume. Welcome to the smellscape of the Middle Ages. The fire crackles on unbothered. It's open, central, and relentless. With no real chimney, just a hole in the ceiling, the smoke lingers, curling through rafters, and clothing settling like a house guest who's lost the hint. After a single evening in this home, your tunic now smells like 5 distinct meats, 3 cooking fats, and 1 highly suspicious cheese. Historians still argue whether people of the time noticed these smells at all. Did they become nose-blind, or was this simply the baseline aroma of existence? With few alternatives, no scented candles, no laundry detergent, no dry shampoo. This may have been the medieval equivalent of homey. But to your nose, fresh from the future, it's intense. You notice a pot of lard sitting by the fire. Not a bowl, a pot. It's used for frying, roasting, sealing jars, greasing pans, and probably minor home repairs. The lard is reused over and over again, filtered only occasionally through cloth or fingers. Bits of last week's fried onions float lazily across the surface, sunbathing in porky peace. Someone dunks a handful of root vegetables into a shallow pan and starts frying. The smell sharpens into something more assertive. Onions, sizzling carrots singing their high note. It's better than the stew marginally. Still, the smoke from the pan adds a new layer of haze to the room. Your eyes water. Again. Quirky fact: animal fats weren't just for cooking. People used them in lamps on shoes, even on their skin. That sheen on your neighbour's cheeks. Not sweat. Probably beef tallow. Shiny and flammable. The floor beneath your feet is sticky in spots. No one seems bothered. Food scraps get swept aside with a stiff broom or stomped down underfoot. In many homes, dogs and chickens help clean by gobbling anything edible or not. You nearly trip over a goose. It glares at you like it owns the place. Honestly, it probably does. Some kitchens hang dried herbs from the beam: sage, rosemary, lavender. They're meant to mask the smell, or at least keep the rodents guessing. But the effect is subtle and overwhelmed by the constant presence of grease smoke and simmering something. You wander toward the back corner and find a pile of cloths, stiff with age and use. Dish rags, towels. The answer is yes. One is used to lift pots from the fire. Another might be a napkin. One may have once been a shirt. Everything in here has been repurposed at least twice, and still smells vaguely of turnip. A nearby cupboard creaks open to reveal a stack of bowls, wooden, scorched, stained. There's no soap, so washing dishes involves rinsing them, in hot water sometimes, with sand or ashes for abrasion. The result cleanish, but never clean. You touch one, then immediately wipe your hand on your tunic. Mistake. Now your tunic smells like fermented radish. The ambient air is thick, warm, not unpleasant if you're into ham-scented humidifiers, but definitely not breathable in the long term. Your eyes itch. Your throat scratches. You glance longingly at the open door where the outside world waits cool and unscented. But the fire crackles behind you, holding you in place. Because despite it all, there's a strange comfort here. The smell might be overwhelming, but it's also familiar. It's the smell of meals shared of generations stirring the same pots of soot-stained aprons and stories told over bread crusts. This is the scent of continuity. You sit back down beside the hearth. Someone passes you a dish of roasted onions. They're caramelized, soft, dripping with lard. You take a bite. They taste. Not bad. Sweet. Smoky. Just slightly greasy. You realize you're adapting. You're settling in. Your nose still twitches, but less violently now. The smoke stings, but it no longer blinds. Even the goose seems less judgmental. You're starting to smell like here. And in the Middle Ages, that might be the biggest compliment of all. You're halfway into your lard-soaked roasted onions when the room suddenly shifts in energy. The door creaks open. A gust of cold air breezes through. And with it comes nobility, or at least someone who owns more than 2 tunics. Their boots are polished-ish, their sleeves are embroidered badly, and they carry themselves like someone who hasn't had to chew salted fish in a while. You've entered the rarefied world of noble dining, where the food is fancy a stranger, and still somehow not all that tasty. They sit, not with the peasants near the fire, but at a long table set with actual linen. A servant brings out silverware, not individual sets, mind you, but enough spoons to rotate. The feast begins, and you're invited to observe. Maybe even nibble, but only politely. The first dish arrives under a damp cloth. It's a peacock. No, really. still wearing its feathers artfully reattached post-roast. It looks majestic and deeply confused. The meat is dry, the skin is leathery, but it's impressive, and in the medieval noble world, impressive often beat edible. This was the age of culinary spectacle. Historians describe elaborate dishes, swans, that sang thanks to hot air piped through their beaks, pies that released live birds when cut towers of meat shaped like castles. It was food as theatre designed to wow guests, confuse enemies, and occasionally start small fires. You're handed a slice of something that looks like meat, but tastes like almond milk and saffron. It's called blancmange, a gelatinous dish made from shredded chicken rice and sweet milk. The texture is unnerving. The flavour surprisingly delicate, like pudding that once had a poultry-related dream. Historians still argue whether nobles liked these concoctions or merely tolerated them as status symbols. After all, peacocks weren't raised for flavour, swans weren't exactly tender, and gilded apples literally painted gold probably didn't offer much in the way of nutrition. Quirky tidbit: some nobles employed food sculptors whose entire job was to shape marzipan jelly and dough into mythical beasts, coats of arms, and the occasional edible saint. Imagine biting into St. Christopher and tasting pure sugar and almond paste. You try a sip of the wine offered. It's sharp, borderline vinegary. Nobles often drank spiced wine heated with cloves, cinnamon, or sugar to mask spoilage. You're told this one is imported from France, or at least from a guy named Francois who claims he once saw France. Next course, a meat pie. The crust is fluted, the filling thick with mutton and prunes. You're excited until you bite in and realise someone's gone heavy on the black pepper. Your nose twitches. Your tongue recoils. You reach for your beer. Mistake. It's not beer. It's warm mead with floating herbs. Possibly mint. Possibly something that used to be mint. Still, there's no denying the effort. Nobles dined with flair. Even in cold stone halls with draughts sneaking under the door, and fireplaces that heated only the two people standing inside them, the food was meant to impress. It was a culinary arms race. The more exotic the better. You're shown a bowl of almond milk cheese, a clever workaround for fasting days. It's creamy, nutty, and honestly, not bad. Then comes something called a sotelty, a decorative centerpiece made of pastry dough and imagination. This one is shaped like a ship, complete with sails made of roasted pigskin. You're not sure if it's meant to be eaten feared or applauded. The contrast to peasant fare is obvious. While common folk survive on porridge, and luck the nobility spend hours crafting dishes that double as conversation starters. But even so, not everything is glamorous. The kitchens are still smoky. The flavours still lean heavily on preservation and guesswork. And under all that gold leaf, it's often just stew. You glance back toward the hearth, where the villagers are scraping burnt onions from a pan. They laugh, argue eat with their fingers. Here at the Lord's table, no one laughs too loudly. No one spills. There's etiquette, napkins, politeness, even boredom. You start to miss the stew. Still, when a small dish of candied fennel seeds is offered for digestive cheer, you accept. It's sweet, crunchy, and refreshingly modern tasting. Your stomach feels mildly soothed. A boy walks past with a tray of sugared rose petals. You blink. He offers you one. You chew it. It tastes like perfume and ambition. As the feast winds down, a servant clears the table with a cloth sweep, gathering crumbs into a bucket that will be fed to dogs, pigs, or even people further down the social ladder. Nothing is wasted, not even the peacock feathers. You rise from your borrowed stool full, but not satisfied. The noble meal was a show, elaborate, expensive, and curiously empty. The half stew may have tasted like moss and error. but it had soul. And in the end, even a roasted swan with cloves up its nose can't replace that. You shuffle away from the noble's long table, your stomach unsure whether it was just blessed or bamboozled. Your mouth still buzzes faintly from the sugared rose petals and spiced wine, but now someone's handing you a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in linen, are strange little nuggets, brown, shriveled, oddly fragrant. A treat. Nope. Spices. And tonight you learn that in the Middle Ages, spices were the true flex. Gold was flashy, jewels were loud, but nutmeg could get you knighted. Your host cracks a grin and says the nutmeg alone cost more than a sheep. You believe them. Medieval Europe's relationship with spices bordered on obsession. Not just for taste, though, that helped, but for status health, and sometimes to cover up the fact that what you were eating was not entirely fresh. You're offered a tiny pinch of cinnamon on your bread crust. It's warm, comforting, and completely out of place, but you smile politely. This is a big deal. Spices were imported from lands most Europeans had never seen. India, the Spice Islands, Arabia. Getting them involved caravans, oceans, pirates, bribes, camels and prayers. And when they finally reached the table, they were used sparingly, or sometimes not sparingly at all, because if you were rich, you wanted people to taste your wealth. Historians still argue whether spices were used to mask spoiled food, or simply to show off. The idea that spice-covered meat hid rot is appealing but not entirely fair. Spoiled food made people sick in any century. Most likely spices enhanced bland dishes, made tough meat feel exciting, and gave rich folks something to talk about between courses. You're handed a dish of roasted apples with cloves. It smells like the holidays. It tastes sharp, oddly sour, and faintly smoky. You nod in appreciation. A noblewoman nearby mumbles that cloves are good for toothaches, and honestly, that tracks. Quirky tidbit. Medieval cooks also used spices in ways that would baffle a modern chef. Ginger in fish pies, cinnamon on lamb stew, nutmeg in eggs. The flavour profiles weren't about sweet versus savoury, they were about what feels expensive and vaguely medicinal today. You watch as a boy carries a spice chest across the room. It jingles. Inside are drawers labelled with beautiful Latin names, Piper nigrum, Zinziber, Garryophyllum. The chest itself is locked. Yes, locked, because spices were valuable enough to be stolen. In fact, in some places, stealing a sack of pepper could land you in stocks or worse. You're invited to smell some mace, the lacy red casing of a nutmeg seed. It's earthy, peppery, and oddly familiar. Then comes grains of paradise, a spice from West Africa, now nearly forgotten. It has a citrusy kick, and was once seen as a viable pepper substitute when black pepper got too pricey. You try a few. They zing on your tongue like medieval pop rocks. The kitchen smells different now. Less like smoke, and fat, more like an exotic apothecary. There's cardamom in the air, star anise, maybe even a whisper of saffron, though it's so expensive most people only dream of saffron. A single thread could flavour an entire pot, or at least make it seem like it had. And yet, this bounty isn't common. The average peasant likely went their whole life without tasting clove. Maybe pepper, if they were lucky. More often they flavoured food with onions, garlic, mustard seed, and vinegar. Even horseradish, which could clear your sinuses and make you cry over your porridge. You think back to your first stew, the brown bowl of boiled mystery. It had no spice, just warmth. It filled you up but left your palate asleep. This little tray of exotic dust. It wakes something up. It's not better, just louder. You look around the room and realise something: the smoke hasn't gone anywhere. The soot still stains the ceiling. The meat is still overcooked, the bread still dense. But with spices, the illusion of flavour changes everything. It's not just about taste, it's about storytelling. A pinch of ginger says you've been places. A shake of pepper says you matter. A clove on your roast. That's aristocracy, baby. You smile, savouring the last of your clove apple slice, and reach for a bit more cinnamon. Why not? You're practically royalty now. Just don't sneeze. In this century, spilling spices is a crime of passion. Your noble clove moment fades as you're ushered outside into the chill of early night. A servant hands you a rough wool cloak that smells faintly of sheep and old onion. You're going on a short walk, not far, just around the side of the house to the barn root cellar and tool shed combo that feeds the kitchen. Time to discover how food gets from field to fork, to regret. The barn doors creak open to reveal a jumble of sacks, baskets and half-sleeping chickens. There's no refrigeration, of course. No cold storage, just cool dirt floors, drafty walls, and a constant hope that rats don't get too bold this season. Inside a straw-lined box, apples are slowly shrivelling into leathery memories of autumn. A bag of onions has sprouted. The carrots look like they've been emotionally compromised. This is medieval fresh. A servant shows you a smoked ham still hanging from a beam. It's glossy. It's green in places. They reassure you it's perfectly aged. You believe them. You also take a respectful step back. Historians still argue how consistently food could be preserved without modern tools. In colder climates, root cellars worked miracles. In warmer ones, salt, smoke and vinegar were essential. But in most cases, medieval storage was a game of rotating stock praying over pickles and eating quickly before something hatched inside it. You step into the root cellar, a dark, cool pit dug into the ground beneath the house. The air is damp and still. Crates of turnips, beets, cabbages and dried beans line the walls. They're sorted loosely edible, questionable, and only in an emergency. You spot a potato, but it's not a potato, it's a rock. Easy mistake. Quirky tidbit. Some villagers packed produce in sand or straw to slow down spoilage. Others hung herbs upside down in windows or coated eggs in lard to keep them fresh. Still others just dried everything. If it could be smoked, salted, brined, pickled, or desiccated. Beyond recognition, it stood a chance. Outside the shed, a small garden struggles in the moonlight. Right now, it's empty early spring. But come summer, it'll grow cabbage leeks, broad beans and sorrel. No tomatoes, no peppers, no corn. All those New World luxuries haven't arrived yet. Instead it's old school kale that bites back onions with a grudge and herbs you think are mint, but maybe weeds. You crouch near the compost pit. It steams gently like something alive. A mix of food scraps, animal waste straw, and wishful thinking. It smells rich. Maybe too rich. But this is how medieval farmers fed the soil. You wonder what microbes live in there. Then you decide not to wonder anymore. Back inside, you pass the grain bin. It's full of oats and barley, rough ground, and speckled with something suspiciously wriggly. You look closer. Yup, weevils. Tiny beetle-like insects, beloved scourge of pantries everywhere. No one seems surprised. People just sift and move on. You pause at a wooden scoop and realise with mild horror that the grain you're holding will be in tomorrow's porridge. Still there's no waste. Anything slightly off gets repurposed. Mouldy cheese gets scraped. Wilted greens become stew. Old bread becomes toast, then crumbs, then filler for sausages, then feed for pigs. It's a circle of culinary life. Unforgiving, yes, but resourceful. And the animals, they're not just livestock. They're pantry extensions. Chickens provide eggs, sure, but also feathers for beds, bones for broth, and eventually themselves for soup. Pigs eat everything. Goats provide milk and a shriek that wakes the dead. Cats, meanwhile, serve as rodent control tiny judgy kitchen guards with murder in their eyes. A boy runs past you with a basket of duck eggs. You ask where the ducks are. He points upward. You don't ask further. As you re-enter the kitchen, through the back door, your cloak now scented with hay ash, and possibly goat breath, you realise something odd. You're not shocked anymore. You're acclimating. You've seen the whole grim supply chain, and while it's rough, it works. Food in the Middle Ages doesn't follow a recipe. It follows necessity. What's ripe, what's stored, what hasn't turned. What can be scraped, stewed, or soaked until it resembles something edible. You sit back by the fire, watching someone sift oats through a mesh. A weevil crawls across the table. They flick it off without looking. Tomorrow it might be part of breakfast. You sip your warm ale and think, it's not farm to table, it's more like field to guesswork to eventual digestion. But it gets the job done. You've returned to the warmth of the hearth, your hands still dusted with grain and mystery compost. A bowl is handed to you, some sort of stew again, and you reach out reflexively, only to realise you don't have a spoon, or a fork, or even a napkin, because now it's time to learn the fine art of medieval table manners, a thrilling world where cutlery is rare, fingers are default, and etiquette walks a thin line between practical and perplexing. First the trenchers return. You remember them, those thick crusty slabs of bread that double as plates, and sometimes weapons. Today yours has a slosh of oily lentil mash slowly soaking in. You're told to eat the trencher last, once it's absorbed all the flavours. You nod solemnly, as if you've always known that. You pick up a wooden spoon from a communal pile. It's sticky. You don't ask why. The person beside you has a knife, a sharp, personal one tucked into their belt. That's the main utensil of the age. People bring their own. Knives are used for cutting, scooping, poking, and occasionally warning off greedy neighbours. A noble might own a two-pronged fork, but for most folks, forks are still suspicious. Foreign, possibly sinful. Historians still argue whether forks were outright banned by some church officials or just frowned upon as decadent. Either way, you don't see any forks tonight, just lots of fingers. You watch as someone dips a chunk of bread into thick soup, uses their thumb as a stopper, and slurps it like a medieval oyster shooter. Efficient, messy, slightly heroic. Quirky tidbit etiquette in the Middle Ages wasn't just about manners, it was survival strategy. You needed to eat quickly, cleanly, and without offending anyone who might control the food supply. There were rules. Don't blow your nose on the tablecloth. Don't lick your knife. Don't double dip in the communal sauce bowl. If you must spit, turn your head and aim for the floor near your foot. Always your foot. Never the Lord's. You follow the lead of your neighbours cautiously, breaking bread with your left hand and scooping lentils with the right. You're careful not to drop anything. You don't wipe your hands on your tunic, though you want to. Instead you reach for a damp cloth hung from a peg. It smells of onions and ambition. You dab politely. Someone next to you lets out a mighty belch. No one reacts. In some cultures that's considered rude. Here it's merely feedback. A large joint of meat is passed around on a platter. No one uses serving spoons. Everyone slices a piece with their personal knife, spears it, and moves on. You do the same, feeling like a veteran. The meat is overcooked and chewy, but it's warm, and your fingers feel powerful holding it like a medieval turkey leg. You pause to glance around. There's no background music, no soft clink of glassware. Just chewing low voices and the crackle of the fire. The atmosphere is intimate, primitive, and weirdly dignified. Then someone sneezes into their sleeve and keeps eating. You learn quickly that the communal experience is part of the meal. Everyone shares bowls, plates, trenchers. People tear off chunks of bread and hand them down. One child eats directly off their mother's lap. An older man wipes gravy from his beard with a chunk of crust. It's not glamorous, but it's bonding. Of course, noble dining is a different beast. The etiquette is everything. A noble might have a carver, a cupbearer, even a napkin boy. These roles aren't just fancy, they're security. Who better to trust with your wine than someone whose sole job is to taste it for poison? But back here in the hearth, lit corner of a rural home, you rely on tradition, on communal understanding, and on the hope that no one sneezed into the soup pot. Another quirky detail in some households' fingers were washed in perfumed water before and after meals poured from elegant ewers into ceramic basins. It was more common among the wealthy, but even modest homes might use a shared wash bowl. You spot one now passed from person to person. You dunk your hands. The water is lukewarm and contains a floating herb you don't recognise. You dry your hands on your cloak. At this point, who's judging? The meal winds down. The trencher soaked in juice and scraps is now edible. You tear into it. It's surprisingly flavourful, like stew-infused toast, with notes of ash and background cabbage. You chew thoughtfully, slowly, your fingertips glistening with lard and dignity. You've made it. You've dined with only your fingers, a borrowed spoon, and the strength of your medieval etiquette. You didn't stab anyone with your knife. You didn't insult the bread. You didn't lick the communal salt. You, my friend, are now officially table-trained in the age of castles and cabbages. You lean back on your stool, belly, oddly full fingers still carrying the faint glaze of lentil oil and ancient stew when someone cheerfully claps you on the back and announces, "Feast tomorrow." You blink. Another meal. No, not just a meal. A feast. A real one. Roasted meat, sticky tarts, overflowing trenchers. And for a split second, you forget the smoke and ash and lard that's already tattooed your insides. Until someone adds, "We've had 3 straight feast days. Famine's coming." Ah, yes. You've arrived at the whiplash world of feast-famine and the occasional rat. Medieval food culture wasn't consistent. It was a yo-yo, either too much or absolutely nothing. Feast days brought gluttony, indulgence, entire roasted animals spinning on spits. But then came the weeks when the cupboards held only onions and prayers. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had regular access to food or lived in a near constant state of edge of starvation. The answer lies somewhere in the middle. Most years were okay, lean winters, tight summers, but survivable. Then came the bad harvests, the failed rains, the years when grain rotted in the field and salt fish went missing from the docks. You're invited to help prep for tomorrow's feast, St. Mildred's Day, you're told. You don't know who she is. Neither does anyone else. But it's a reason to roast things, and that's enough. In the open courtyard, chickens flutter nervously. Someone's plucking feathers. A child runs by with a bowl of dried apples sticky with honey. There's an undercurrent of excitement in the air and tension, because after the feast, it's Lent, and after Lent, possibly nothing. Quirky tidbit, during the worst famines, people boiled tree bark to make bread. Others dug up ferns or ground acorns into gritty flour. In France, during the Great Famine of 1315, chroniclers describe people boiling leather. Yes, actual leather, to make soup. Others whispered rumours of cannibalism. Most preferred not to ask. You meanwhile have been handed a pie shell to fill. It's made of a dense flour paste, hard unseasoned, and designed more for structure than taste. You ladle in a mix of dried mushrooms, parsnips, and a few elusive bits of rabbit. Someone jokes that the rabbit was caught just this morning. Someone else mutters, or last month. You stir carefully. The mood shifts again. People are talking about the year without summer, when hail destroyed the barley. About the great pig sickness, when half the village's livestock died in 2 weeks. About that one Christmas where the only thing to eat was eel soup and boiled hay. And yet here they are, laughing, preparing, sharing. A jug of mead is passed around, stronger than usual. This one was saved for the occasion. You take a sip, it's floral rich and vaguely suspicious. You sip again anyway. Someone hands you a candle and leads you to the storehouse. Inside, they've got sacks of grain tucked in corners, wheels of cheese rubbed with ash to keep pests away, and jars of preserved fruits floating in syrup the colour of old sunrises. This is emergency treasure, to be rationed if the frost lingers too long. Still, the rats always find a way. One scurries past your foot like it owns the place. You nod in greeting. It ignores you as usual. Back in the hall, a boar's head is being prepped. It's ceremonial mostly, decorated with rosemary sprigs and apples in the mouth. Not everyone gets a slice, but it makes for a grand entrance. There's singing, a drum beat, a child holding a carrot like a trumpet. You notice something touching the best bits, the tender meat, the rare spices, the little sweet tarts are quietly passed to the oldest at the table. The sick, the pregnant. Even the hungry dog in the corner gets a scrap. In times of feast, medieval folks knew how to give, but it never lasted. And they knew that too. So they ate heartily, with urgency, with joy, but also strategy. Because famine was never far. Not in this world. One bad month and the pies would be gone. The trenches dry. The stew a memory. You take another bite of pie filling. It's warm, savoury, spiced with actual pepper. For a brief moment it feels like comfort, like safety. You almost believe you're not about to chew tree bark in 2 weeks. Almost. The night winds down. People curl into cloaks. Someone hums a song about a goose that laid cheese. You think it's a metaphor. You hope it's a metaphor. The fire crackles low. Outside the air is cold but quiet. You hold your cup half full with mead and worry. Feast today, famine tomorrow. But for now, the pie is still warm. You wake at dawn, your back stiff from sleeping on a straw-stuffed mattress, and your mouth tasting faintly of pickled turnips and ash. A rooster screams nearby, less a crow than an indignant cough. And you shuffle toward the hearth, guided by the scent of something cooking. And by something, you mean live eels. Because today's breakfast challenge is understanding when fresh meant still moving. The pot on the fire bubbles gently. Inside it, several long, shiny things writhing in slow motion. Eels. Slippery, glistening, and disturbingly enthusiastic about not being eaten. One makes eye contact. You nod respectfully. This is medieval fresh. Back then, refrigeration wasn't an option. And while fresh today means crisp lettuce and same-day sourdough in the Middle Ages, it often meant harvested this morning and still twitching. That included eels, fish, poultry, sometimes frogs, and on more unfortunate days, snails. You watch as someone gently prods an eel back into the pot with a stick. No one flinches. It's just another Tuesday. Eels were a staple food in many parts of medieval Europe, especially in England and the Low Countries. They were abundant, easy to trap, high in fat, and could survive for hours or even days outside water. That made them perfect for transport fasting days and confusing visitors like you. Historians still argue whether eels were truly beloved for their taste or simply tolerated out of convenience. The texture is gelatinous, the skin is oily, and unless seasoned heavily, the flavour is somewhere between fish and chewy rubber hose. You're offered a plate. The eel has stopped moving, which helps. It's been simmered with vinegar leeks and a hefty helping of mustard seeds. You take a tentative bite. It's tender, sort of. Fishy, definitely. But oddly, edible. Quirky tidbit Some monasteries spread eels in moats, releasing them like aquatic livestock. Others even paid rent in eels, a practice so common that records from the 1200s list payments in thousands of them. So yes, in the medieval world, you could technically own an eel-based economy. You chew slowly, ignoring the skin's occasional squeak between your teeth. Across the room, someone is gutting a pike, its mouth still agape. Fish flopping on the floor isn't unusual here. In fact, it's a sign of luxury. If your dinner wasn't moving earlier, it might have been dried, salted, or suspicious. Then there's the crayfish, tiny freshwater crustaceans, often gathered by children in baskets near the riverbank. They're dumped into a bowl, alive, boiled, and served whole. Shell legs, awkward expressions and all. A few escape. No one panics. You remember a conversation from last night, someone reminiscing about the fresh goose they'd prepared for a feast. Fresh in that case meant butchered on the table, defeathered beside the fire, and served within hours. For most households, there was no such thing as aged meat, unless it was salted to the point of being a solid. Fresh also extended to dairy. Milk straight from the goat. Cheese only days into its fermentation. Cream churned and spooned out before it even thought about going sour. The danger of bad milk was real, so speed was safety. Butter was often yellowish, only because it had flecks of parsley or marigold mixed in to fake freshness. You're handed a cup of egg posset, a warm drink made of milk, eggs, ale and sugar. It's frothy, slightly sweet, slightly not sweet. Some versions curdle on purpose. This one may have done it by accident. You drink it anyway. It's tradition. Back by the fire, a boy is chasing a chicken with string. Dinner, it seems, is a hands-on experience. The bird squawks, loops around a bench and knocks over a bucket of parsnips. No one intervenes. In fact, someone bets on which way it'll run next. You sit on your stool, watching the eel bones sink to the bottom of your bowl. The stew has thickened. Your appetite has adjusted. Because you understand now, fresh isn't a luxury here. It's a necessity and a challenge. It means catching something at just the right moment before it turns, before it changes, before the sun shifts and the air warms and the bugs arrive. It means wriggling, food, flapping, food, steaming food the second it's ready. It means trust the kind that comes with watching your meal try to escape and choosing to eat it anyway. So you slurp the last of the broth, wipe your hands on your tunic, nod to the eel. He would have done the same to you. You've chewed eel, outlasted bread with the tensile strength of roofing tile, and learned to accept stew as a personality trait. But now as the coals die low, and your host hands you a final crust of something vaguely edible, you realise the strangest truth of all. You survive dinner. Somehow, the bowl is empty, the trench is gone, your cloak smells like a fireplace had an opinion. And as your belly sighs, not out of joy, but from the sheer exhaustion of digestion, you feel peaceful. Tonight was a full meal, by medieval standards. Nothing fancy, but more than enough. No one counted calories back then. They counted calories that didn't kill them. And you made it. You glance around the room. The fire has calmed to a whisper. A few people have already slumped over heads, resting on folded arms, feet tucked under benches. A dog gently licks someone's bowl. No one bothers to stop it. Dishes won't be washed, just rinsed maybe, or scraped clean with dry straw and stacked for morning, or in the corner, a single candle burns low. The room smells of ash cabbage and warmth. Not pleasant, but familiar, and at this point, even comfortingly human. Someone snores. It's a gentle, bubbling sound. Maybe the man, maybe the dog. You don't investigate. Historians still argue whether this sort of meal was typical or special, whether peasants endured endless bland gruel or found little ways to make dinner bearable by sharing seasoning or sneaking the last bit of bacon when no one looked. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, just like everything tonight. Quirky tidbit: even in the hardest winters, people found a way to flavour food. If there were no spices, they used tree resin. If no meat, they thickened broth with egg yolks. If nothing at all, they added hunger and called it flavour. Your cloak hugs your shoulders as you sink closer to the hearth. The floor is hard. Your stomach is full, if unsure what it's full of. But the glow from the fire is hypnotic, and slowly sleep comes creeping in, like smoke curling up the chimney that doesn't really exist. So now just let your eyes rest a little. You've walked across muddy fields, stirred stews that never stopped simmering, and chewed on crusts tough enough to outlast the century. The embers still crackle softly, like someone whispering old kitchen secrets to the walls. The smells fade into the background: wood smoke, garlic, a hint of lard. Not as sharp now, just gentle, settled, like memory. Outside the village is asleep. The sky hangs low, with stars quiet and silver. The chickens are roosting. The last eel has gone still. Even the rat in the grain bin has curled up into some tiny burlap dream. You made it through medieval dinner. Through the salt, the smoke, the oddly enthusiastic cabbage. And maybe, just maybe, you've come to understand how someone in the year 1264 could eat that same stew taste, the same ash-dusted crust, and still smile at the fire. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the darkness of the old hall surround you, like a blanket worn soft with stories. There's nothing left to chew, nothing left to salt, just rest. Hey guys, tonight we're setting the table for a truly underwhelming feast. Imagine it's dusk in a muddy medieval village. The thatch roof above your head drips just a little, the fire sputters, and your stomach growls like a wounded boar. You settle onto a lumpy bench at a wobbly wooden table. Someone ladles something grey and slightly steaming into a cracked bowl. Surprise, it's barley gruel, again. You're going to need your imagination here, because if you're expecting anything that resembles food as you know it, cheeseburgers, sushi, even a decent slice of bread, you're out of luck. This is the Middle Ages. And if you're not a lord or a bishop, food isn't about flavour. It's about not starving. You trudge into a one-room cottage, the air thick with wood smoke and cabbage steam. The family's gathered around a cauldron hanging over the hearth. What's cooking? You already know pottage. A kind of endlessly recycled stew made of barley. Maybe oats boiled with whatever roots they dug up that day. Turnips, leeks, wild garlic. On a lucky day, someone tossed in a bit of old bacon rind, or a handful of beans. The taste warm, bland, slightly earthy, and probably your best shot at nutrition for the week. Mainstream historians agree the diet of medieval peasants was relentlessly monotonous. The basis of nearly every meal was grains coarse, unprocessed, and boiled into soft submission. Barley and rye for the poor. Wheat if you were very lucky or lived in southern France. Sometimes you'd get bread. More on that joy later. Pottage was sort of the slow cooker of the Dark Ages, but without the seasoning, or meat, or variety. People would keep a pot going for days, even weeks, tossing in new ingredients and water as old ones disappeared. Which sounds kind of charming, until you realise it's less of a recipe and more of a survival mechanism. There were no fridges, no seasoning shelves, no takeout menus. You ate what you grew or traded. And by the time winter hit, you were eating whatever you stored, which might include dried legumes, old onions, or cabbages, so pungent they'd bring tears to a knight's eyes. Still, there's something meditative about imagining yourself there, sitting quietly spooning up that steaming, lumpy barley mix. The fire crackles. Someone snores. A chicken clucks in the corner. your eyelids grow heavy, and the world shrinks to the rhythm of wooden spoons scraping wooden bowls. The fringe fact. Some folks added crushed bone to the mix for calcium. Or maybe just texture. Who's to say historians still debate whether pottage was a choice or a last resort? Was it the comfort food of the masses? Or just all they had? Either way, as you lift the last spoonful to your lips, you realise something. This wasn't a meal. It was a ritual, a quiet, repetitive act of keeping the body going in a world where survival depended on doing it all again tomorrow. You wake up the next morning to the sound of a rooster that's more threat than melody. You stretch, yawn, and then immediately remember breakfast. Not because you're hungry, but because there's not really such a thing. If you're lucky, someone scraped yesterday's pottage into a rough lump and pan-fried it into something resembling a patty. Otherwise it's just bread. And not the fluffy sourdough kind that inspires Instagram posts. This bread, it's hard, dark, dense, sometimes gritty, and it actively hates your teeth. See, in much of medieval Europe, especially for peasants, bread wasn't just food, it was the food. It accounted for as much as 70 to 80% of the daily diet. But what kind of bread you ate told the entire story of your social rank. Nobles got fine white loaves made from sifted wheat flour, smooth, almost cake-like. Peasants. They got what's called maslin bread, a cheerful little blend of rye barley and possibly a handful of pebbles. Okay, not deliberately. But milling grain in the Middle Ages often meant grinding it between massive stone slabs, which shed grit into the flour. By the time you bit into a slice of peasant bread, it had the texture of mild sandpaper. Some scholars argue this is why so many medieval skulls have worn down or even broken teeth. You weren't just eating to live, you were slowly eroding your molars into dust. And it gets worse. In bad harvest years, people added anything to make the grain stretch tree bark, ground acorns, even chalk. It's like the anti-artisan loaf. You don't pay extra for texture, it comes free with the risk of stomach cramps. The funny part, bread was so important that bakers had their own guilds regulations, and even legal oversight. In England, the assize of bread and ale was a real thing. It regulated the weight and price of loaves to prevent people from being ripped off during famines. But still you could eat it, kind of. You'd dip it in broth or milk to soften it up, or if you're fancy, drizzle a little honey on it, just a little. Sugar? Forget it. That's for royal weddings and church feasts. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In some places loaves doubled as dishes. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, served as edible plates at noble tables. After the meal, they'd be handed to the poor, tossed to the dogs, or if especially soaked, fed to pigs. So yes, medieval fine dining came with biodegradable tableware. Eco-friendly before it was cool. And here's where historians disagree. Some claim that even the poorest peasants ate fresh bread daily, baked in communal ovens. Others insist that bread was a once-a-week treat, reserved for Sundays or market days. It likely varied wildly by region and season. But one thing's consistent. Whether you were biting into a crumbly rye roll in Scandinavia, or a dense barley flatbread in Normandy, you weren't savouring it. You were surviving it. And praying the next bite didn't chip a tooth. Still, as you imagine yourself chewing slowly, perhaps by candlelight or morning fog, there's something grounding in it. This bread was real, heavy, honest. It didn't promise delight. Just one more bite toward not going hungry. By midweek, your dreams of tender bread have given way to something meatier, or so you hope. Because meat in medieval Europe was less dinner staple and more rare glorious accident. You stare into a bubbling pot, hoping to spot a bone a shred, a single strand of anything that once walked or flew. And then you smell it. Salty, smoky, slightly sour. Welcome to preserved meat. your best hope for protein and your worst enemy when it's gone wrong. Unless you're a noble or a poacher, and good luck surviving that trial fresh meat was more rumour than reality. You dear peasant probably ate pork, if anything at all. Pigs were popular because they ate garbage and didn't need pasture. But even then, a pig was valuable. You didn't just casually roast it on a Tuesday. No, you salted it, dried it, maybe smoked it in the chimney. A good piece of pork could last weeks, months, even if you prepared it right. Or very wrong. Mainstream historians agree that meat in the Middle Ages was mostly reserved for special occasions, feast days, or bribes to your landlord, and when it was available, preservation was the name of the game. No fridges, remember, just salt, air, smoke, and blind optimism. A popular technique was larding where lean meat was literally threaded with strips of fat to keep it moist. If that sounds like medieval charcuterie, just add mould and lower expectations. You might also encounter something called souse, a delightful combination of boiled pig's feet and vinegar. You eat it cold, with your hands, like sadness in jelly form. And yet you'd be excited, because most days your protein came from beans, or peas, or the same barley again. Some regions fared better than others. Fishing villages had salted herring and eels. Forest dwellers might trap rabbits or birds, but hunting was usually illegal for commoners' wild game belonged to the king or the local lord. Which means if you were caught snaring a deer, you weren't just hungry, you were suddenly a criminal. Some historians argue that harsh anti-poaching laws weren't just about preserving game, but also preserving class divisions. Your stew pot told everyone exactly who you were. Now for your fringe tidbit, in some parts of Europe, people tried to refresh old meat by boiling it with wine herbs and wait for it milk. This did not make it fresher, it made it stranger. Scholars still argue whether medieval cooks truly believed this method revived spoiled food, or whether they were just out of options. The line between culinary creativity and desperation gets fuzzy when your pantry is full of salted tongue and dried eels. You tear into a strip of jerky hard pork. It's chewy, it's over-salted, but it's meat. And tonight that's enough. The fire crackles, the pot hisses, and you settle back belly full of something vaguely savoury, knowing that tomorrow it's back to cabbage and barley again. But for now, you've tasted richness. And that lingering flavour, somewhere between victory and brine, carries you gently towards sleep. Tonight you don't eat at home. You're invited to the Lord's manor, or at least you sneak close enough to peer through a warped window and fantasise. Because if you thought your pottage was plain, what's happening inside that hall might as well be from another planet. Golden light flickers on tapestries. Servants bustle. Long wooden tables groan under the weight of food you can't name, let alone pronounce. Someone just wheeled in a whole roast peacock, still dressed in its own feathers. And is that a pie with live birds inside? You're not hallucinating. That's just how they did it. Feasting in medieval noble courts wasn't just about eating. It was theatre, political performance, a demonstration of wealth power and the ability to waste half a boar on a Tuesday. You with your turnips and sour ale are not part of this play. Mainstream historians agree that noble feasts were carefully orchestrated affairs. Menus could stretch for hours, up to 20 courses in some cases. And it wasn't just about meat. There were sugared almonds, intricately layered jellies, and things called subtleties. Edible sculptures made of marzipan or pastry, often shaped like castles, saints or lions. It was impressive and exhausting. Each dish was carried in with ceremony. Musicians played, people gawked, and only the highest ranked guests got the good stuff. If you were sitting at the far end of the table, you might still end up with pottage, just with a fancier spoon. But the flavour? Oddly, not great. Despite access to ingredients, medieval nobles had a strange relationship with taste. They loved their food, sweet, sour, and spicy all at once. A duck might be cooked in almond milk, seasoned with cinnamon, and served with sugar on top. Your modern palate wouldn't know what hit it. There's a myth now, widely debunked, that they use spices to cover up rotting meat. In truth, spices were too expensive to waste that way. They were status symbols imported from far-off lands. Saffron pepper cloves. These weren't used to salvage old goose. They were used to dazzle. Still, you can't help but chuckle. All this pomp, and yet no forks. Diners use knives, fingers, and stale bread trenchers to scoop their food. You imagine the lord solemnly lifting a peacock leg with his bare hand, grease running down his sleeve. It's less Game of Thrones and more elaborate picnic. Here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. Some noble households had official taster rolls, people who sampled every dish for poison before it reached the lord's plate. Historians still argue how effective this was, or if it was more performative than practical. Either way, not a dream job, you sigh. Outside the manor, the stars are bright. Your belly rumbles and your cloak doesn't do much against the wind. Inside, a bard begins to sing about knights and destiny, while the guests reach for another handful of sugared pine nuts. You step away quietly, crunching over frost-covered grass. Back home, the hearth still glows faintly. You ladle out some barley and cabbage pottage and sit by the fire. The feasting halls may be grand, but the quiet of your own home with steam rising gently from a cracked bowl carries its own kind of comfort. And as the night deepens, that comfort stretches into drowsiness. The next morning, as you gather firewood with a grumbling stomach, you find yourself wondering, wasn't everything drowned in spices back then? That's what people always say, right? That medieval food was so bad they had to cover the taste with cloves and cinnamon. But as you toss a few damp sticks onto the fire, the truth is much more complicated and far less flavourful than you might hope. Here's the short version. Spices were not used to mask rotting meat. They were used to brag. Mainstream historians agree that spices were status symbols, tiny aromatic badges of wealth and global reach. Peppercorns from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka. Though Europeans thought it grew in mysterious far-off trees guarded by birds, and nutmeg from the Banda Islands all made their way across long, treacherous trade routes into the hands of those rich enough to afford them. So no, your spoiled mutton wasn't getting a dash of nutmeg to make it edible. More likely you weren't getting mutton at all. If you were rich, your cook might simmer duck in clove-infused broth, or add ginger to almond sauce. But if you were a peasant, the most spice you saw was wild garlic, maybe mustard seed. Maybe, and even nobles didn't necessarily season food for taste the way we do. Their goal was often to shock, confuse, or show off. Sweet and savoury were not separated by coarse meat pies, might come with raisins and sugar. Fish might be dyed bright green with parsley. Your quirky tidbit tonight. They sometimes dyed their food on purpose. Not just icing or candies, meat, rice, eggs. Blue foods were especially prized thanks to ingredients like turnsole, a medieval plant-based dye that turned your meal the colour of a bruise. Delicious. And here's the scholarly squabble historians still argue just how common these spices were in everyday upper-class meals. Some claim spices were used liberally. Others insist that records of spice purchases were more ceremonial than culinary. Like having a bottle of champagne on a shelf you never open, because the point is owning it. So as you sip your own humble barley broth, spice-free, and steaming faintly in the cold morning light, you realise that flavour wasn't the medieval priority. Calories were. And prestige. If something happened to taste good, that was just a bonus. Still, the idea of a saffron-sprinkled trout with almond and vinegar custard does make you shudder slightly. Perhaps bland isn't so bad. Outside the sun never really rises. It just changes the shade of grey in the sky. You finish your broth slowly, the warmth seeping through you like a blanket. You lean back and your eyelids start to droop, lulled by the thought of blue meat and cinnamon goose. You decide to take a walk. Not far, just beyond the village, where the stone path winds toward the monastery. It's quiet here, the kind of silence that hums in your ears. And the scent that greets you. It's something between baking bread, wet wool, and cheese. You've entered the domain of the monks keepers of books, brewers of ale, and surprisingly innovative cooks in a world where flavour was optional. Monastic kitchens were more than places to feed the faithful. They were experiments in survival sustainability and the occasional culinary breakthrough. You pass a row of herb gardens and step into a warm room filled with steam and the low clatter of pots. Today's menu: cabbage, stew, lentil mash, maybe a poached egg if the chickens have been cooperative. But here's the surprise it tastes. Okay. Unlike many peasants, monks had structured daily routines that included specific meals, specific fasts, and crucially access to a lot of land. Monasteries often owned gardens, orchards, livestock, even fisheries. They could grow and preserve with a bit more freedom than the average serf. And when they weren't chanting or copying manuscripts, they were stirring pots. The most famous legacy cheese. Monks didn't invent it, but they refined it. Cheeses like Munster Roquefort and Stilton owe their existence to quiet afternoons in cloisters, curdling milk-salting wheels, and checking on mould like proud parents. Mainstream historians credit monasteries with preserving and advancing food techniques during Europe's messiest centuries. Fermentation, pickling, brewing, these weren't just chores, they were sacred work. After all, wine was communion, bread was the body, and cheese, well, cheese was lunch. Tonight's quirky tidbit: some monks brewed beer specifically for fasting days. It was called liquid bread-rich yeasty, and designed to provide calories when solid food was banned. In Bavaria, some versions of this beer were so hearty you could practically chew them. You watch a monk slowly ladle a thick, creamy soup into a clay bowl. He gestures for you to sit. You do. There's no rush, just the soft scrape of spoons and the distant hum of bees outside. Still, even in paradise there are rules. Monastic diets varied depending on the order. Benedictines might eat fish. Cistercians might avoid animal fat altogether. Some ate twice a day, others only once. Scholars still debate how strictly these rules were followed, or if the kitchen monks snuck a sausage or two when nobody was looking. But tonight, under the arch of a stone ceiling, surrounded by flickering candlelight, and the soothing rhythm of monastic routine, your belly is warm. You sip your soup slowly, savouring the quiet, and the way it anchors you in time. There's no feast, no theatre, just sustenance. Just crafted carefully, offered humbly, and somehow good enough. You close your eyes, the spoon rests in the bowl, and sleep presses gently at your shoulders like a woolen robe. You awaken the next morning to the sound of church bells, slow, sonorous, and relentless. That can only mean one thing: it's another fasting day. And yes, there are a lot of them. In the medieval Christian calendar, fasting didn't just mean skipping a meal. It meant abstaining from meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs depending on your region, your bishop, and how nervous your local cook was about eternal judgment. Which means today's menu is creative. You make your way to the communal kitchen. The air smells faintly of onions and something suspiciously fishy. A young apprentice is pounding something pale and wet into a paste. Almond cheese, he says, without looking up. For the fish pies. You nod, trying not to look concerned. On fasting days, Fridays, Wednesdays, Lent, Advent, And about a third of the calendar, medieval cooks had to swap out forbidden animal products with plant-based substitutes. And while that sounds trendy now, back then, it led to some truly odd inventions. Take almond milk, not a splash in your iced latte, but a labour-intensive concoction of ground almonds and water used in everything from soups to custards. It was the go-to replacement for dairy, and if you had access to almonds expensive, but possible, you could at least make something look creamy. Fish, meanwhile, was your best hope for protein. Not grilled salmon or sashimi, think eels, salted herring, dried cod, and in one terrifying case from a coastal recipe book, boiled lamprey and vinegar jelly. Mainstream historians note that the medieval church's fasting rules created an entire economy around acceptable foods. Markets thrived on fish days, and cooks invented elaborate mock meats, like fake eggs made of almond paste and dyed with saffron. And here's tonight's quirky tidbit. In some regions, beavers were classified as fish because they lived in water. That's right, if you were wealthy and persuasive enough, you could eat beaver tail during Lent without spiritual consequences. Historians still argue whether this was sincere theology or just the medieval version of a loophole. You sit at the table, a bowl of pike paste is set before you. The texture is challenging, the flavour, somewhere between muddy and metallic. You choose slowly, because what else can you do? Across the table, someone sprinkles vinegar on their cheese. A monk blesses the meal. A child makes a face and tries to swap her eel for bread. No one accepts, and yet it fills you. Warmth spreads through your fingers, up your arms, into your chest. The sky outside is pale grey. The fire inside glows orange. You sip a broth made from leeks and herbs, seasoned with salt and thyme. It's not delicious, but it is calming. You lean back, watching the steam rise from your bowl. In a few hours you'll be hungry again, but for now your belly is full of fishy, almondy oddness, and your eyes are drifting. By mid-afternoon, the hearth is low and the kitchen is quiet. You step outside, stretch, and decide to wander through the gardens, the source of so much of your medieval menu. But don't expect tomatoes or corn. Those won't arrive in Europe for another few centuries. Instead, you'll find a humble sprawl of green things, mostly edible, many bitter, all painstakingly grown by hand. You start with the leeks. They're everywhere. Hardy, frost-tolerant, and incredibly versatile leeks were a medieval favourite. You've already eaten them 3 ways this week, in broth, mashed with beans, and roasted into something that vaguely resembles a pancake. Then there's the cabbage. Big, dense and earthy. Cabbage was the unsung hero of the peasant plate. It stored well in winter, grew with minimal care, and if boiled long enough, almost lost its smell. Further down the rows you spot onions, garlic, parsnips, and broad beans. Most are dull by modern standards, but each one had its place in the medieval culinary arsenal. You brush a hand over some savoury and thyme herbs, used more for preservation and symbolic charm than for bold flavour. Mainstream historians note that vegetable plots or kitchen gardens were vital to survival, especially during the long winters and fasting seasons. But they weren't lush or wildly diverse. Most peasants grew what would fill a belly, not a basket of colours. And here's a fun fringe detail: many of these gardens doubled as apothecaries. That mint wasn't just for tea, it might ease your stomach. That fennel, chewed for fresh breath, or brewed for milk production in nursing mothers. Your garden was both pantry and pharmacy, but not everything here is friendly. You glance at a patch of nightshade. Pretty, deadly. Medieval herbals list it as both poison and cure, depending on dosage and luck. Historians still debate how much peasant herbal knowledge was practical versus superstitious. You stoop to pick a sprig of dill. Nearby, a child digs up a carrot. Not the bright orange kind you're picturing, these are pale, lumpy and vaguely purple. You both shrug. In the corner of the garden stands a single pear tree. Its fruit is mealy, but sweet enough to feel like a treat. You take one bite into it, and immediately wish you hadn't. It's underripe, and your teeth ache from the tang. Still, you chew and swallow. This is what dessert looks like in your world. The sun dips lower. Chickens scratch at the edge of the fence. You sit on a stone pear in hand and listen to the wind rattle the dry stalks of last season's kale. The air smells like compost and thyme. It's quiet, and for a moment everything feels perfectly still. Your eyes begin to blur. Not from tears, just fatigue. The kind that comes from early mornings and turnip dinners. The kind that lulls even the busiest mind into stillness. You head back to the cottage, pear mostly forgotten in your hand, and realise something you're thirsty. Not peckish, not craving. Just that simple, scratchy dryness in your throat that says, you need a drink. But in medieval Europe, even this humble request comes with a little danger. The water, not safe, not even close. You glance toward the village well, but everyone knows it's hit or miss. 1 week it's fine. The next, someone drops in a dead rat. Or worse. And with no concept of germs, most people didn't really understand why bad water made them sick, just that it did. So what do you drink instead? Beer. Always beer. Not the kind your uncle brags about brewing in his garage either. Medieval beer was often weak, sour, flat and murky, more of a meal than a beverage. And yet it was considered safer than water. It had been boiled. It had alcohol, however, minimal. And it filled your stomach. Mainstream historians tell us beer was a staple of the medieval diet, especially in Northern Europe. Even children drank it, though their version called small beer had very little alcohol. Think of it more as barley-flavoured tea than anything you would find at a pub. In some places, cider or mead stood in for beer. In monasteries, ale might be thick and hearty. In villages, it was usually thin and sour. Either way, it was wet. And that counted for a lot. Your quirky tidbit tonight. In parts of Eastern Europe, people made kvass, a fermented drink made from stale rye bread. Slightly fizzy tangy, and a little suspicious. It was the Slavic cousin of beer, and filled many of the same roles: nourishment, hydration, and a mild buzz if you drank enough of it. You finally settle down at a worn wooden table. Someone sets a clay cup before you. It smells like wet hay and roasted grain. You sip it cautiously. It's lukewarm and a little bitter, but it's safe. Probably, and then there's milk, sometimes available, often avoided. In towns, fresh milk spoiled quickly. People turned it into butter or cheese as fast as they could. Goat's milk was more common than cows in many areas, and it too had to be consumed fast, or not at all. Wine only if you lived in the right climate or had the right connections. And unless you were wealthy, your wine came cut with water herbs, or whatever they had lying around. Historians still debate whether people drank water more often than we assume, or whether their reliance on weak alcohols was as absolute as the records suggest. Maybe they rotated. Maybe they adapted. But tonight your cup is empty, and your head is light. Not drunk, just tired. The fire is low. The beer is gone. You curl up on a straw mattress, belly warm, mouth dry, but oddly content. Your last thought before sleep. Tomorrow you'll drink earlier. Morning fog hangs low as you shuffle into the kitchen. Today's task: cook something. Anything. You're in charge, which sounds like a treat until you realise what that actually means. There's no recipe book. No measuring spoons. Just a few onions, a slab of turnip, some dried herbs, and a lot of smoke. You glance up at the ceiling where iron hooks dangle over the fire. One is already in use. A blackened pot swings lazily from a chain, as if it's been there since last harvest. Probably has. Welcome to medieval cooking, slow hot, and a little dangerous. You add water from a bucket. Add the onions. Stir with a wooden spoon that's more splinter than tool. The smoke stings your eyes, curls your hair, and settles into your clothes like a clingy spirit. You're coughing before you even get to the beans. This was how most food was prepared over an open hearth with no temperature control, and a very real risk of burning your eyebrows off. Mainstream historians point out that the hearth wasn't just the cooking area, it was the heart of the home. It provided heat light and a flat surface to set a hot rock on when you needed to fake an oven. Baking rare unless your village had a communal oven which was often only fired up a few times a week. That's why most bread was either dense and stale or flat and fried. You adjust the chain height to bring the pot closer to the flames. The stew bubbles angrily, as if resenting your efforts. You toss in the turnip. It lands with a thud. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval cooks used hot stones dropped directly into liquid to heat things faster. Kind of like dropping lava into your soup. Effective. Also terrifying. You stir the pot, then move to the side table, where a rough slab of dough waits to become something vaguely like a pancake. There's no oil, so you slap it onto a flat iron plate and hope for the best. The edges burn before the centre firms up. You flip it anyway. Historians still argue over how much culinary skill the average peasant had. Some believe food was purely functional, boil it and be done. Others insist there were regional techniques passed down like folk songs, little tricks to make cabbage sweet or beans less gritty. But either way, no one was adding a garnish. By the time the stew is ready, it smells fine, you think? It's hard to tell through the wood smoke. You ladle it into bowls and serve it with pride. The pancake is charred on one side, but edible. Barely. Everyone eats quietly hunched over the table, the heat from the hearth, a small mercy on a damp morning. It's not delicious. It's not even memorable. But it fills the gap. And as you settle into your own bowl spoon, scraping the bottom for the last bit of onion and turnip, your shoulders relax. The fire pops softly. The air is thick and warm. You made something. With smoke and fire and whatever the pantry gods gave you. It wasn't elegant, but it was enough. Later that day, you're still picking ash from your hair when someone hands you a bowl of something they proudly call sauce. You nod politely. You've learned better than to ask too many questions. But curiosity wins. You take a bite. Your face puckers immediately. Is that vinegar with parsley and mustard and wait, clove? Welcome to the world of medieval sauces. Not so much a flavour enhancement as a philosophical challenge. You'd think with all the spices, nobles would have invented something like barbecue sauce or gravy. But no, most medieval sauces were tart sharp or outright confusing. Vinegar was a staple. So was verjuice, an acidic juice made from unripe grapes or apples. Mixed with herbs, garlic, and sometimes sugar, this sour base was ladled over everything from roast meats to fish. Because why not mainstream historians explain that taste back then wasn't about balance. It was about contrast. Sweet and sour, hot and cold, dry and wet. If your duck was dry, you drenched it in a sauce made of wine, raisins and vinegar. If your pork was salty, you balanced it with honey and mustard. Or you didn't. It really depended on who was cooking and who was paying. Tonight's quirky tidbit. There's a recorded recipe for a sauce made from almond milk, ground rice saffron, and gingerbread crumbs. That's not a joke. Historians still argue whether this was meant to accompany meat dessert or simply impress dinner guests into polite silence. You dip a crust of bread into your own bowl. It's tangy, then sweet, then spicy, then uncertain. The kind of taste that makes you tilt your head and look at the ceiling as if clarity might descend like a divine source from above. And still you keep eating. Because sauces weren't just for flavour, they signalled wealth. If your host could afford spices vinegar and imported ingredients, you knew they were doing well. If you had a full sauce course, yes, that was a thing, you might be in the presence of royalty. Of course, peasants made sauces too in their own way. Pounded garlic and vinegar. Mustard mixed with horseradish. A bit of broth thickened with breadcrumbs. Humble, sharp, and mostly just there to make barley feel new again. You sit back from the table, the sauce bowl half empty in your hand. Your tongue tingles slightly. Your eyelids droop. The air smells of burnt bread and thyme. Outside, someone calls for the evening meal. Inside, the sauce lingers on your palate, strange and sour, like a memory. You're not quite sure you enjoyed, but one that's warm and oddly comforting all the same. Night falls early, again. The cold presses through the wooden walls like a polite but persistent ghost. You're curled near the fire, listening to it pop softly, when someone mentions a neighbour who got the belly sickness. No one makes eye contact. You just nod solemnly and stir your broth. Food safety in the Middle Ages was more like food roulette. You ate what you had hoped for the best, and if you made it through the week without vomiting, that was a win. Mainstream historians agree that one of the deadliest aspects of medieval cuisine wasn't the lack of nutrition, it was contamination. Between poor hygiene spoilage and zero understanding of bacteria, meals could be landmines. Take ergot, for example, a nasty fungus that grew on rye, and when ingested caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Entire villages were once struck by outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, named for the burning sensation it caused. Imagine your bread tripping you out and lighting your nerves on fire. Still hungry, milk could sour in hours. Meat spoiled overnight. Eggs went bad quietly and without remorse. Fish. If you smelled it, you were probably already in trouble. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some people believed that certain foods caused imbalance in the humours of the body. Eat too much cold wet food, like cucumbers or fish, and you'd fall ill from excess phlegm. Hot dry foods like pepper or wine were said to balance that out. Historians still argue whether cooks actually followed humoral theory when planning meals, or whether it was mostly medical window dressing. You sip your weak ale and nod again. Because really, what else can you do? You think about how far we've come, the fridge, the expiry date, the concept of washing your hands. And yet there's something grounding about knowing people manage to live, love, and occasionally throw a feast without any of that. Someone across the room belches quietly. Everyone ignores it. A moment later, a loud sneeze. You stare into your bowl and stir slowly, willing your stomach to stay calm. Later, wrapped in scratchy wool, you lie on your straw mattress, thinking about spoiled bread and sour fish and miracle survival. You're still here, somehow. And as the fire crackles one last time, the darkness feels less threatening and more earned. You drift towards sleep, imagining the quiet heroism of every stomach that managed to get through dinner unscathed. You dream of gold-leafed pastries and honey-drenched fruit, but when you wake, it's to the smell of boiled fish and stale oats. The feast was imaginary, the reality leftovers, and not the good kind. But today someone brings out a treat, a rare delicacy, they say. Your stomach tightens with cautious hope. It's jellied fish paste with goose fat. Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval luxury foods. You may think delicacies were about sweetness or richness, but in medieval Europe, luxury often meant complexity, rarity, and sometimes sheer audacity. The more effort it took to make, or the less likely it was to actually taste good, the more impressive it seemed. Mainstream historians explain that elite cuisine during the Middle Ages prioritised extravagance. You didn't just serve food, you performed it. Dishes were sculpted into mythical beasts layered in gold leaf, or even engineered to move. There are documented cases of pies that opened to reveal live birds, roasted animals redressed in their own feathers, and even entire castles made of sugar paste. Tonight's quirky detail. One French court menu included a whole roasted swan, presented in full plumage, reassembled post-cooking wings, posed dramatically as if in flight. No one remembers what it tasted like. That wasn't the point, but it wasn't all show. Nobles and clergy had access to ingredients peasants could only dream of: saffron, rosewater, almonds, imported sugar. Yet even with these, the taste profiles were challenging. Think sweetened eel, spiced porridge with pork fat, wine-drenched prunes served with duck tongues. Historians still debate whether these dishes were genuinely enjoyed or simply tolerated for the sake of prestige. Were these rich folks really into cinnamon cod stew, or did they just not want to seem poor? You take a cautious bite of the jellied fish paste. It's salty, it's fatty, it's aggressively cold. You nod, pretending it's delicious. Everyone else does the same. It's less about enjoying and more about enduring with style, and yet you can't help but respect the craft. These were meals built by candlelight by hand, without timers, scales, or recipes. Every strange flavour was a testament to creativity under constraint. The sun sets again. You sit by the fire belly, full of something that defies description. The flames flicker. The bowl in your hands is empty. And slowly your thoughts fade, not from satisfaction, but from the strange quiet calm that comes when the last bite is behind you and you've survived another dinner. The next morning you hear giggling, tiny feet on cold dirt. A child chases a chicken past your door, holding a crust of bread like its treasure. You follow the sound into the kitchen and see a group of children gathered near the fire. Their eyes are wide. Their bowls are very empty. Welcome to childhood medieval style, where meals were more wish than guarantee. If you were lucky enough to survive infancy, and that was not a given, your early years were shaped by hunger. Not dramatic starvation always, just the slow, persistent ache of never quite having enough. Mainstream historians estimate that up to 30% of children died before the age of 5. Those who lived often faced chronic malnutrition. Meals were small, food was rationed, and if the adults went hungry, the children fared worse. Breakfast, maybe some watered down ale and stale bread. Lunch pottage, if the pot hadn't run dry. Dinner, another bowl of soup so thin you could see your future through it, and it looked like cabbage. Tonight's quirky tidbit: in some households children were fed pap, a goopy mixture of breadcrumbs soaked in milk, or ale, occasionally sweetened with a bit of honey if you lived with a generous grandmother. Think of it as medieval oatmeal's sadder, drippier cousin. You crouch beside a young girl who's trying to barter a single apple slice for an extra spoon of lentils. She smiles, missing her front teeth, and offers you half the fruit. You pretend to take a bite, then hand it back. She nods solemnly, as if you've shared a pact. Children's diets were deeply affected by season, class, and location. Noble children might have access to roast meat cream and pastries, though they too endured fasting and medicinal diets. Peasant children, on the other hand, lived on whatever was available, and often that wasn't much. Historians still debate how involved children were in meals. Did they eat separately? Were they expected to serve the adults first? In some households, likely yes. In others, mealtime was a communal affair. Quiet, swift, and unceremonious. One thing's certain. Food for children was more about learning than leisure. You learnt not to ask for seconds. You learnt how to make a crust last all day. And you learnt very quickly to eat whatever was placed in front of you, no matter the colour, shape or smell. As evening falls, you sit with the children near the fire. One little boy licks the inside of his bowl, then wraps it in a bit of cloth and sets it aside. For tomorrow, he says. Your breath catches, not from sadness, but from the fragile, brave hope in his voice. The sense that tomorrow might bring something better, or at least something warm. You tuck a blanket around your shoulders and close your eyes, the quiet chatter of small voices lulling you toward dreams. In a world where food was rarely easy, even the smallest bite meant everything. By now, the fire is just a memory, glowing embers nestled deep in ash. The cottage is quiet. Outside the sky is a velvet blue-black stars barely flickering through the cold. And you're still thinking about dinner. Or rather, the long, slow rhythm of every dinner, because in medieval Europe, hunger wasn't just a moment, it was a constant, a soft hum in the background of every day. You sit alone at the table, fingers wrapped around a cracked clay cup, still warm with watered ale. A crust of bread sits in a bowl, soaking in broth that tastes like it's been reheated far too many times. You chew slowly, letting the weight of it settle in your stomach. There's no feast coming, no pie with birds, no sugared fruit or roast boar. Just this, a quiet evening, a tired body, and a soup made from memory and hope. Mainstream historians note that for most people in medieval Europe, life was a steady loop of labour and scarcity. You worked the fields, you ground the grain, you fed the fire, and for all that dinner might still be just pottage and prayer. But even that mattered, because food wasn't just fuel. It was community. It was ritual. A shared spoon, a hot bowl, the last crust split 3 ways, tonight's quirky detail. Some medieval households believed the final scoop of soup belonged to the youngest child, or to the household spirit, depending on your region. Historians still argue whether this was a form of superstition, or simply a small kindness baked into tradition. You stare into the fire pit. There's no flame now, just faint warmth. But it's enough. Around you, the room breathes slowly, timbers creaking, a breeze slipping through the thatch, someone murmuring in their sleep. You feel full, not from food, but from the strange intimacy of simplicity. Because here's the truth, in a world where food was mostly terrible, monotonous, gritty, bland, it still mattered. It still brought people together. It still tasted like home, even when it barely tasted like anything at all. And now as your eyelids grow heavy, the long rhythm of peasant dinners turns into something softer, slower, sleepier. And so the embers fade. The last spoon is set aside. The cottage, the garden, the smoky kitchen all dissolve into stillness. You stretch out under a thin wool blanket, the scratch of it familiar and grounding, the scent of leek and ash still clings faintly to your sleeve. It's quiet now, not silent, but gentle. A kind of hush that settles in old wood and tired limbs. Outside, the wind whispers through bare branches. A rooster mutters somewhere in a dream, and the night wraps itself around the village like a second blanket. Your breath slows. Your thoughts drift. Maybe tomorrow there will be a fresh loaf, or a carrot sweet from the frost, or maybe just the same old stew. It doesn't matter. You've lived it. You've tasted it. You've made peace with the porridge. So let it go. Let the barley and the bean fall away. Let the fire fade. Let the hunger quiet. You are full of story of stillness, of the soft rhythm of lives long past. Now close your eyes. Let sleep settle in. Let the past hold you gently. You made it to the end, and tomorrow will come, but not yet, not yet. Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a world of stone cloisters, candlelight prayers, and oddly enough, beer for breakfast. You wake up on a straw mattress, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, your breath puffing faint clouds in the chilly air. A bell tolls softly in the distance, calling the brothers to morning prayer. Your stomach growls, but it's Lent, and that means no meat, no dairy, no solid food. But don't worry, there's beer. Not the kind you'd sip at a barbecue or see advertised during a football game. No, this is liquid bread, a rich, yeasty, slightly cloudy drink brewed by monks who were technically trying to not eat at all. Somehow, you've stumbled into the one place in medieval Europe where devotion and fermentation happily coexist. You pull on your robe and shuffle toward the cloister courtyard, the cold stones shocking your bare feet awake. The monastery is quiet, except for the whisper of robes and the rustle of leaves outside. Everything moves slowly here, like the thick amber beer that bubbles softly in casks behind stone walls. This isn't a tavern or a pub, it's a house of prayer. But within its cold halls, a strange compromise was struck between asceticism and survival. Monks needed calories to endure long hours of fasting prayer and labour. And since solid food was restricted, especially during Lent, they turned to the brew kettle. Mainstream historians agree that monastic beer was more than just a drink, it was sustenance. Thick with unfiltered grains and alive with yeasts, it provided energy, hydration, and even nutrition. It filled the belly without technically breaking the rules. You pass through a heavy wooden door into the scriptorium where brothers illuminate manuscripts by candlelight. The smell of ink mingles with that faint, sour, sweet tang from the brewery down the hall. You're not imagining it. Every monastery worth its salt had a brew house, and most brewed multiple batches a year. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some orders took their Lenten brewing so seriously, they sent samples of their beer to the Pope to see if it was too indulgent. According to one popular tale, by the time the beer reached Rome, spoiled and rancid from the journey, the Pope declared it perfectly penitential. If this is what they drink, he supposedly said, let them have it. Historians still debate whether this story is apocryphal or accurate. Either way, the message was clear. Liquid bread was better than breaking Lent outright. You make your way toward the kitchen, where warm steam and the scent of grain wrap around you like a blanket. A brother hands you a cup. The beer is dark, warm, and thick enough to chew. You sip. It's strange, comforting, slightly bitter. And somehow, holy. The sun hasn't climbed far above the horizon, and already you've heard the bells 3 times. Prime, terse, sext, each a gentle interruption in a day built not around lunch breaks, but around liturgy. But if you're hungry, well, tough luck. It's Lent. You shuffle into the chapel with the other monks. The floor is cold. The air smells of wax and wool. Voices rise in chant, calm, slow, deeply resonant. You let the words wash over you, not needing to understand Latin to feel their weight. Hunger grumbles again, but no one reacts. Hunger is expected. Because Lent, in a medieval monastery, it wasn't just give up chocolate season. It was 40 days of intentional, often uncomfortable sacrifice. Monks were already ascetic in their normal routines, and during Lent, those routines got even leaner. Mainstream historians agree the Benedictine rule, which many monasteries followed, demanded daily fasting during this season, no meat-limited meals and simple food prepared without fanfare. Some orders added extra restrictions, skipping solid food entirely during daylight hours or for the entire stretch. But monks weren't foolish. They needed energy to copy manuscripts, chop would chant psalms and tend to the sick. So they turned to a small holy loophole: drinking wasn't eating. And beer. Well, it wasn't exactly food. Right. Here's your quirky tidbit during Lent. Some monastic communities limited themselves to just 1 meal per day after sunset, but allowed themselves to drink up to 5 litres of beer. Not the modern light pilsner, mind you. This was hearty, bready stuff, thick with calories and protein. Basically soup, but bubblier. Of course, historians still debate just how literal the fasting was. Were monks truly giving up food for weeks? Or did creative definitions of solid and meal allow them to bend the rules without technically breaking them? One thing's certain, beer was the bridge. You sit in the refectory as evening falls, bowl, empty cup, full. A single candle flickers on the long table. The beer is slightly warm, unfiltered, almost chewy. It fills your belly. It hushes the growl inside you. And best of all, it doesn't count as cheating. Technically. A bell tolls again, completing the final prayer of the day. You rise slowly. The beer in your stomach has turned to warmth. Not buzzed, not full, just satisfied. A holy loophole passed from mug to mouth. The fast continues tomorrow. But for now, the silence, the candlelight, and the beer blur into one soft, sleepy blur. The morning bell calls again, and your limbs ache faintly from yesterday's chores. There's no bacon, no eggs, no bread, waiting, just another long stretch of fasting. But you're not worried, because the monks have a secret weapon tucked neatly behind the garden wall of the brewery. You follow a narrow stone path, past rows of leafless grapevines and frost-tipped cabbage heads. The door to the brewhouse is slightly ajar, and the moment you step inside, the air hits you like a warm, yeasty hug. Barley smoke and something tangy, almost sour. It's the unmistakable scent of fermentation and quiet defiance. This isn't just a side hobby. This is survival by the mug. The concept of liquid bread might sound like a clever marketing trick, but it was very real to medieval monks. Beer, especially during Lent, was packed with calories from malted grains, nutrients from yeast, and just enough alcohol to calm the nerves after a hard day of silence and cold floors. Mainstream historians agree beer wasn't a loophole out of laziness, it was a deliberate, practical solution. Monks brewed beer strong enough to nourish the body while still abiding by the spiritual restrictions of fasting. And they didn't just settle for one recipe. Enter the Doppelbock. Brewed especially for Lent, Doppelbock was a strong, dark, malty beer, thick, sweet, and almost syrupy. It was originally called Salvator Latin for saviour, which to a hungry monk staring down another 30 days of soup-free evenings must have felt extremely accurate. Your quirky tidbit tonight. Some records suggest that monks even called this beer the blessed bread in a cup. It wasn't just fuel, it was sacred sustenance. You sit by the hearth as a monk stirs a steaming pot of mashed grains steeping in hot water, slowly transforming starch into sugar. His movements are slow, methodical, almost meditative. Brewing was more than just a chore, it was an act of devotion. Patience, precision, and prayer all stirred into one wooden vat. Scholars still argue whether these beers were truly nutritionally complete, but no one denies their centrality to the monastic rhythm. The process was physical, the product was spiritual, and in a world where Lenten meals meant near starvation, a heavy ale was nothing short of a blessing. The fire crackles, the mash bubbles. You sip your morning brew, just a small cup, and feel it coat your ribs with warmth. Outside, the wind howls across the fields. Inside your stomach, quiets. Your thoughts slow, and for a moment you forget the hunger entirely. The morning chores begin with a clang, metal on stone. Somewhere behind the main chapel, a monk is hammering a fresh wooden tap into a barrel. You follow the sound into the still forming shape of a brewhouse. The walls are thick limestone, the beams overhead soaked with centuries of steam and yeast. Building a monastery brewery wasn't just a weekend project. It was serious business, equal parts architecture, engineering, and divine logistics. You roll up your sleeves and lend a hand, lifting heavy sacks of barley from the storage room. The floor is slick from yesterday's cleaning, and every step smells like malt, salt, and damp wool. A brother gestures toward a hand-cranked mill. Time to crush the grain. Mainstream historians agree that most monastic breweries were robust operations. Some brewed for internal use only, but others, especially large abbeys in Germany or Belgium, ran full-scale brewing facilities, producing enough beer to feed the monks, the staff, the pilgrims, and even local townspeople. Some monasteries had multiple brew houses, one for strong beer, one for weak, one just for the lay workers. You watch as the crushed grain pours into the mash tun, mixing with hot water. It looks like oatmeal. It smells like bread soup. You stir slowly with a long wooden paddle, feeling the mixture thicken. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monks measured brewing temperatures not with thermometers, but by plunging in their bare elbows. Too hot to touch, too cold to extract a system both imprecise and surprisingly effective. The fire under the kettle hisses. You take a break and wipe your forehead, then glance around the brewhouse. Hooks hang from the ceiling. Barrels line the walls. A small opening in the roof lets out steam and lets in a shaft of golden morning light. This isn't just a place of work, it's a holy engine. The monks believed that labour was a form of prayer, and nowhere was that clearer than here, where physical effort produced something nourishing for both body and soul. Scholars still debate the exact scale of some monastic breweries. Were they full-on businesses or just self-sustaining side projects? Evidence suggests it varied. Some abbeys shipped barrels for profit. Others gave their surplus to the poor. But all brewed with discipline. You sit on a low bench and sip yesterday's batch, now slightly warm and lightly fizzy. A brother beside you says nothing, only nods, both of you staring at the bubbling vat like it's a stained glass window. And maybe in a way it is. A sacred process framed in steam and patience. You wake early the next day to the scent of barley steeping and wood smoke curling in the air. Today's task, brew day. The sun hasn't quite climbed over the garden wall, and already the monks are gathering buckets, hauling water from the well, and preparing the day's sacred transformation grain into beer. It's less a recipe and more a ritual practiced over centuries, passed down without paper preserved in gesture. You step inside the brewhouse again, and the warmth is immediate. The floor is already damp from the morning's cleaning. The copper kettle glows faintly in the firelight. A monk hands you a cup of wort, the sweet liquid extracted after mashing the grains. It tastes like sugar water with a whisper of bread crust. Not quite beer yet, but close. Mainstream historians agree that brewing in medieval monasteries relied on a few simple ingredients. Water malted grain, usually barley hops, though not always, and yeast. But of course, no one in the 12th century said yeast. It was called God is good, a miraculous foam that appeared if the air was right, the timing perfect, and the brewer properly humble. The grain is mashed, then lautered, the liquid drawn off, filtered through straw or cloth. You help stir the thick brown mash shoulder to shoulder with two silent brothers. There's no need to speak. The hiss of steam and the scrape of the paddle are enough. Once the liquid is collected, it's time to boil. The kettle groans as fire licks its belly. Hops are added if you're in the right part of Europe. Some monasteries still use a mix of herbs called gruit, including mugwort yarrow and rosemary. You wrinkle your nose as someone crushes dried herbs into a fragrant dust. Bitter, sharp, strangely soothing. Tonight's quirky tidbit: in some abbeys monks weren't allowed to brew during matins or vespers, the holy hours of darkness and dusk. So brewing schedules had to weave around prayer bells. You either got up very early or stayed up very late, depending on the rhythm of the day. You peek into the fermentation room, a cooler chamber with thick walls and heavy wooden vats. This is where the real magic happens. The wort is cooled, transferred to barrels and left to rest. If you're lucky, wild yeast will float in and begin the silent transformation. If not, well, better luck next batch. Scholars still debate how consistent these early beers were. Without refrigeration or sanitation, every brew was different. Some batches were fizzy, others flat. Some sweet, others sour. And yet they drank it anyway because it was safe. Safer than water. Safer than starvation. You sit by the open window, a soft breeze brushing your face. The beer is days from ready, but you're not in a hurry. You sip a previous brew, dark, cloudy, faintly nutty, and close your eyes. The brew house breathes around you. Wood creaks. Steam curls. The fire murmurs low. And somewhere in that quiet alchemy you begin to feel full. Not just in your stomach. In your soul. The brew has been transferred. The barrels rest in the fermentation room, their wooden staves wrapped in cool, damp linen to keep the temperature steady. You sit on a low stool near the stone wall, the scent of barley and hops still clinging to your robe. It's quiet now, just the faint hiss of escaping bubbles, the slow creak of settling casks, and the constant rhythm of your own breath. This is the part you don't rush. Fermentation, like prayer, happens on its own time. You gently press your palm to the side of a barrel. It's warm alive. Inside, yeast cells you cannot see are working tirelessly converting sugars into alcohol gas and something else. Something softer. Something holy. Mainstream historians agree that fermentation in medieval monasteries was part science, part miracle. They didn't have thermometers or pH strips or timers. What they had was experience and faith. If the beer bubbled and cleared, it was good. If it didn't, you tried again next week. And here's your quirky tidbits. Many monastic brewers used a special starter from a previous successful batch, what we'd call a yeast culture today. They stored it in cloth on wooden paddles, or even smeared inside fermentation barrels to preserve it. Some called it the blessing, believing its survival from one brew to the next was proof of divine favour. The scent in the room is rich, warm bread, ripe fruit, a little spice. You feel your shoulders drop, your breathing slow. This isn't a busy kind of work. It's a waiting kind. The monks knew that well. Their days were filled with labour, yes, but also with stillness, with time to observe, to taste, to let things unfold. You step outside for a moment, blinking in the afternoon sun. In the distance, the bell tower looms, casting a long shadow over the barley fields. Inside the beer is breathing slowly becoming itself. Scholars still argue whether fermentation was truly understood, or if monks just followed patterns that seemed to work. Maybe both are true. Maybe understanding isn't always the point. You return to the quiet room and sit again, this time with a cup from last week's batch. It's smooth, slightly sour, complex in ways you can't describe but don't need to. You sip slowly, letting the taste bloom on your tongue like morning chant. A brother walks past, nods once, and disappears into the hallway. No one speaks. The beer speaks for them. And in this silence shared over centuries, you feel strangely at peace. Another bubble escapes. A faint glup. You smile. By the time evening bells toll, you've already helped stir mash white barrels and carry buckets of water to the cooling trough. Your arms ache, your feet are damp, and your robe smells like bread dough left too long in the sun. And yet you're content. Because tonight, it's time to sample the good stuff. Not the weak beer meant for guests or labourers. Not the thin table ale served with meals. No, tonight the monks open a cask of their strong, dark Lent brew. The one made to nourish, to comfort, to see them through long stretches of spiritual hunger. You sit at the long wooden table, candlelight flickering over mugs and bowls. No one speaks. This isn't a tavern. It's the refectory. but the silence is full of warmth. Mainstream historians tell us that medieval monasteries often brewed multiple types of beer. The lighter, everyday small beer was low in alcohol and safe for everyone, including children and the infirm. It was the hydrating all-day drink, consumed like modern tea. But during Lent, the monks turned to something richer, stronger, and far more satisfying. The beer in your cup is dark as molasses, nearly opaque in the dim light. It smells like toasted grain, dried fruit, and just a hint of spice. You take a sip. It's thick, almost like sipping velvet, and sweet, with a warming bitterness that blooms on your tongue. Tonight's quirky tidbit. Some of these strong monastic beers could reach alcohol levels comparable to modern wine. The idea was never intoxication, of course. This was still a monastery, but rather nourishment. In the absence of meat, butter and bread, a hearty pint was considered drinkable food. Historians still debate whether monks fully realised how potent their beer had become, or whether the slow build of alcohol over hours of silent sipping simply made them too drowsy to care. You tilt your cup gently, watching the liquid coat the sides like oil. It doesn't fizz like modern beer. It settles, calm, heavy, meant to be sipped slowly like prayer. Around you the other monks drink in silence. No toasts, no clinks. Just a shared understanding that this warmth, this calm, this fullness is the closest thing to a feast they'll have until Easter. The fire crackles. The shadows shift. Someone hums a fragment of a hymn. You finish your drink and set the mug aside, the taste lingering in your mouth like the end of a song. Outside, the sky is deep purple stars beginning to pinprick the darkness. Inside, bellies are full, not from food, but from something gentler. You stretch your legs, your muscles slow and heavy now, and prepare for rest. Because tomorrow is another day of fasting, another day of brewing, another day made softer by the blessed bread in a cup. The next day begins the same way the last one ended, quiet, smoky, and slightly sweet, but today you're not brewing for the brothers. You're brewing for everyone else. Beyond the walls of the monastery, the village stirs. Pilgrims trudge down muddy roads. Poor families queue at the gate. And inside, the monks prepare their charity ale, a brew made not just for the soul, but for the community. You help load barrels onto a wooden cart. The beer inside is weaker than the Lenten Doppelbock, but stronger than water. It smells wholesome, like oat porridge laced with the faintest touch of herbs. A monk hands you a mug to carry. You'll help distribute it. Mainstream historians agree that monastic beer played a major role in medieval life beyond the cloister. Monasteries were more than religious retreats. They were hospitals, inns, schools and bakeries, and the beer they brewed wasn't only for monks. It was for pilgrims on the road, for paupers at the gate, for workers in the fields. Beer was clean, nourishing, and above all safe. As you pour a ladleful into a villager's mug, a small girl peeks around her mother's cloak. She holds out a piece of crusty bread and dunks it with practiced efficiency. Her eyes close as she chews. Not because it tastes amazing, but because it fills the hollow. Here's your quirky tidbits. Some monasteries made medicinal beer infused with herbs like rosemary, sage or wormwood. It was used to treat colds, calm digestion, even ease melancholy. Monks weren't just brewers. They were pharmacists in robes. And yes, some of those herbal beers tasted absolutely awful. But they were cheaper than potions, and patients were much more willing to swallow a foul tonic if you called it beer. Scholars still argue just how central monastic beer was to medieval healthcare. Was it truly medicinal, or just a tasty placebo with a marketing advantage? Whatever the truth, the people came, and drank, and sometimes got better. Back in the brewery, the barrels restock. A monk makes a small chalk mark on the wall to tally the day's distribution. You scrub mugs, watching the yeast settle in the bottom like golden dust. Not a drop is wasted. Later you help roll a small barrel into the infirmary. A brother with a fever groans softly. You pour him a mug thinner than the monk's brew, but still warm, still honest. He drinks it slowly, his hands trembling. You sit with him in silence. Outside, the wind blows through the courtyard trees. Inside, the beer does what it always does. It steadies the heart, fills the belly, calms the mind. And for a moment, in the hush between breaths, you feel something unexpected. Gratitude. The bell rings again. Terse this time, and you find yourself moving through the monastery with practiced rhythm. You don't need a clock. The bells tell you everything: when to pray, when to stir the mash, when to sleep. And yes, when to pour another cup of beer. It's not just prayer and pints. There's a schedule. And within these walls, everything follows it. You sit beneath a high window as golden morning light spills across the stone floor. A monk beside you hums softly while polishing wooden mugs. Another ladles cooled wort into fermentation barrels. The rhythm is not rushed, it never is, but it is precise. Mainstream historians note that monastic brewing was governed by the same structure that shaped the rest of cloistered life. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't mention beer specifically, but it emphasised balance, ora et labora, pray, and work. Brewing slotted in neatly between matins and vespers, a sacred labour punctuated by sacred time. Your quirky tidbit today. Some monasteries had specific brew monks assigned full-time to the beer house. These weren't simply kitchen helpers, they were specialists. Brewing was a revered post, often passed down through generations of monastic tradition. You follow one such monk, Brother Anselm, as he moves methodically through his duties. He checks temperatures not with tools, but by instinct. He tastes the wort with pursed lips and a thoughtful nod. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. His hands have memorised the work. Scholars still debate how much beer production dictated the daily rhythm of the monastery. Was brewing just one of many labours, or did it quietly dominate the routine, demanding time, space and attention as the abbey's most essential craft? As you observe Brother Anselm pour hops into the boiling kettle, you begin to see the answer. The monastery breathes in cycles, yes, but the beer breathes too. It bubbles, ferments, rests, matures, each stage unfolding in time with the bells. You lift a full mug from the cooling shelf. It's cool to the touch, hazy with yeast, and flecked with foam. You take a sip. Not rushed, not indulgent, just timed, measured, perfectly in step with everything around you. You walk back through the cloister. A bell rings again. You don't need to ask what time it is. It's time to be still. You find yourself seated beside a warm window ledge as the sun edges toward noon, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Another bell rings sext. It's time for midday prayer, and also for another cup of liquid bread. As you sip slowly from your wooden mug, a question floats through your mind. Why is this allowed? If Lent forbids indulgence, if food is to be avoided, and pleasures subdued, how did this smooth, sweet, nourishing brew slip through the cracks? The answer, as you might expect, is both theological and convenient. Mainstream historians confirm that the monks justified beer during fasting with an elegant distinction: liquid didn't count as food. It wasn't chewing, it wasn't roasting, it was drinking. And in a time when water could kill you, and soup might be too extravagant, beer was the gentle middle ground between sustenance and suffering. Of course, not everyone agreed. There's a popular and delightfully fringe story about a group of monks who were so uncertain about their strong Lenten beer that they shipped a barrel to Rome, hoping the Pope would decide if it was too luxurious for fasting. Your quirky tidbit. According to the legend, by the time the beer arrived after its long, bumpy, sun-scorched journey through the Alps and Italian valleys, it had spoiled completely. The Pope tasted the sour, bitter mess and supposedly declared, "If this is what they drink during Lent, let them have it." Problem solved. Historians still argue whether the story is true or merely monastic myth. But either way, the result was clear. Beer was allowed, encouraged even. As long as you didn't get drunk or treat it like a feast, it was considered an act of humble nourishment. So the monks brewed, and drank, and fasted, and repeated. You glance down at your mug, feeling the warmth of the beer settle in your belly. You don't feel indulgent. You feel steady, anchored, ready to get through the rest of the day, even if your only food is this slow, dark, bubbling miracle in a cup. Outside a rooster crows as if it's still morning. Inside the air smells like barley and baked stone. You stand up, carry your mug to the wash basin and rinse it out gently. The next bell is hours away, but the rhythm carries you forward. Prayer, work, brew, sip, repeat. Later in the week, the gates creak open and a small group of pilgrims steps through muddy and windblown. Their cloaks are patched, their sandals worn to the thread. One clutches a wooden rosary. Another leans heavily on a crooked walking stick. You help guide them to the guest house, where they'll find clean straw, warm firelight, and of course a mug of monastery beer. This is no act of indulgence. This is hospitality. Mainstream historians remind us that medieval monasteries were among the most reliable waypoints for travellers, especially those on pilgrimages. Whether seeking healing penance or simply a place to rest their weary bones, people came from all corners of Christendom, and the monks met them with open gates and open barrels. The beer they offered wasn't fancy, but it was nourishing, warm, hearty and safe to drink after weeks on unsafe roads and questionable village wells. It was in many cases the first sign of comfort pilgrims had seen in days. You pour a mug for an older man who murmurs a prayer of thanks before sipping. His hands shake slightly from exhaustion, but after a few sips, he exhales as though some tightness in his chest has let go. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some abbeys became so well known for their beer that they attracted more visitors than the shrines they were built to serve. One Bavarian monastery's beer was said to be so good that pilgrims would return yearly, not for the relics, but for the refectory. Scholars still argue whether these monasteries knowingly leaned into this fame or simply let their reputation rise like a perfect batch of frothy ale. Either way, the pilgrims came, and drank, and left renewed spiritually and calorically. Back inside the monastery, the guest house is alive with quiet activity. Blankets are folded, extra mugs are rinsed. A brother ladles stew into a small pot for an especially frail traveller. You refill the cask near the door, the wooden tap creaking gently with each draw. You catch snippets of conversation. Soft voices discussing blisters, blessings, and the colour of the sky in distant cities. Then silence again, as mouths find mugs. Even here in the humble act of sharing beer, there is something sacred. A shared stillness. A gratitude that has nothing to do with indulgence, and everything to do with warmth, safety, and the quiet dignity of being seen. The fire burns low. The pilgrims doze, lined up like books on the floor. You finish your cup and step into the hallway, the stone cold beneath your feet, the night stretching endlessly overhead. The road is long, but here for now it ends with a sip. It's late. The cloister has gone still. Outside, a soft drizzle taps at the stone like fingers on parchment. Inside, the air is thick with quiet. The monks file silently into the refectory robes, swishing candles flickering low. It's time for the final meal, or more accurately, the final sip. You find your place along the long wooden bench. No one speaks. Words have already been spent on the psalms, the prayers, the quiet labour of the day. This hour is for presence, not conversation. A bell chimes softly. Bowls are passed. Mugs are poured. You receive yours warm, dark, gently bitter. The monastery's strong Lent brew. You lift the mug, inhale deeply, and drink. Mainstream historians often note the monastic rule of silence, particularly during meals. It wasn't merely a tradition. It was a discipline, a way to transform even the act of nourishment into meditation. Eating without speaking sharpened attention, deepened gratitude, and slowed the frantic rhythm of thought. You chew your bread quietly, then return to your mug. The beer is thicker than water, richer than broth, and more satisfying than any stew. It slides down slowly, leaving a gentle heat in its wake. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some orders, a single monk was appointed to read aloud during silent meals. Perched on a small platform, he'd recite scripture hagiographies or moral tales, his voice the only one heard, as dozens of brothers sipped in shared contemplation. Tonight's reader recites the life of a saint who once fasted 40 days in a cave nourished only by wild honey and rainwater. You glance down at your dark ale and smile. Not quite as dramatic, but you're trying. Scholars still debate whether monks always followed these silent rules, or if some abbeys were more relaxed, allowing whispered exchanges or discreet eye rolls. What's certain is that this quiet, structured dining had purpose. It wasn't just about rules, it was about intention. Every sip, every bite, every pause was part of the rhythm of devotion. You finish your mug slowly. The taste lingers: toasted grain, dried plum, and a whisper of herbs. Around you, the brothers rise one by one, bowing before leaving the table in orderly rows. No words, just silence like velvet. You stay a moment longer, letting the warmth in your stomach and the hush in the room settle around you like a blanket. The candle beside you gutters. The reader closes his book. Outside, the drizzle continues. Inside, you carry the weight of stillness, and you realise this wasn't dinner. It was a prayer in a cup. The next morning, the brewery is busier than usual. You can hear it before you see it: boots on stone buckets, sloshing voices raised not in chant, but in conversation. Something's different. Something's brewing in more ways than one. You slip inside and immediately see why a new batch is being prepared. But not just any batch, this one's for the spring feast. Post-Lent, the celebration beer. It's stronger, sweeter, darker, and in some monasteries just a little too good. Mainstream historians point out that over time, certain abbeys became known not just for their piety, but for their beer. Some monks took pride in refining their brewing techniques, improving flavour, experimenting with ingredients. The result: monastic beer that rivaled anything found in the surrounding towns, and sometimes drew envy or criticism. Brother Anselm, the monastery's master brewer, moves through the room like a conductor. He adjusts the mash paddle. Here smells a bucket there. Pinches a grain and chews it thoughtfully. There's a gleam in his eye, a glimmer of artistry beneath the habit. Today's quirky tidbit. One abbey's beer was so renowned that nearby tavern owners tried to replicate the taste, going so far as to steal used barrels and scrape out leftover yeast for reuse. Spoiler, it didn't work. Word spread. Merchants sought out monastic ales. Pilgrims made detours. Even nobles wrote letters requesting shipments. And while many abbeys welcomed the extra income to fund their hospitals, libraries and churches, others grew uneasy. Had their sacred brewing crossed into indulgence, scholars still debate how worldly these brewing monks really became. Did they compromise their vows in pursuit of flavour? Or did they see beauty and devotion in perfecting a craft for the good of all? You stand near the fire, watching the water boil. A younger monk stirs with a kind of reverence, like he's praying through the paddle. Brother Anselm adjusts the kettle's lid and looks up at you. He says nothing, just raises an eyebrow, as if to say, "This will be the good batch." You smile, not because it's funny, but because it's familiar. The quiet pride in doing something well, the deep satisfaction in nourishing others, and maybe, just maybe, the tiniest thrill of knowing your beer is the best for miles. Later you sample a small ladle from the test cask. It's not quite ready, but already it's remarkable. Thick, bold, rich with roasted grain and honeyed malt. You sip slowly, letting it fill your mouth, your throat, your chest. The monks may be humble, but their beer sings. A few weeks pass. The days grow longer, the frost recedes from the garden beds, and with it comes a shift in the rhythm of the monastery. Birds return to the trees. Beans are planted. Lent draws to a close. And then one morning the bells ring, not for prayer, but for alarm. You rush to the gate and find a rider bearing paper's boots thick with mud. He delivers the news quickly, dispassionately. The abbey downriver has been seized. Its brewing casks smashed. Its monks expelled. The Reformation has arrived. Mainstream historians agree that the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century didn't just challenge theology, it also disrupted centuries of monastic life. In places like England, Germany and the Low Countries, monasteries were dissolved. Lands were confiscated, and with them, the ancient breweries that had sustained both monks and villagers for generations. Inside the brewhouse, the mood shifts. Brother Anselm examines his tools with quiet precision, as if counting what he might lose. Another monk begins sealing records in a waxed pouch, recipes, harvest notes, ledgers from the barley fields. Your quirky tidbit in some abbeys, monks attempted to hide their best brewing barrels behind false walls, burying small kegs of prized ale like buried treasure. A few of these were discovered centuries later, still intact, sealed under layers of dust and stone. You sit with the brothers that night by the fading fire. The Lenten ale is darker than usual, more bitter, almost smoky. No one says much. The silence feels heavier now, laced with uncertainty. Scholars still debate how much monastic brewing knowledge was lost during the Reformation. Some believe it scattered into secular breweries. Others say entire traditions vanished overnight, like extinguished candles. A few monasteries held on. Remote abbeys in the Alps, the forests, the valleys, places where reformers didn't reach, or where local lords turned blind eyes. But the golden age of monastic brewing was ending. And yet even here, you feel something strange resolve. The beer is still warm in your hands. The tools are still in their place. The grain still grows. You rise early the next morning to help Brother Anselm mash a new batch, just in case it's the last. He doesn't smile, but he does nod once, and that's enough. The steam rises, the fire cracks, and outside the world changes. But in here, for a few more hours, the rhythm holds. The years pass. The walls grow older. So do you. But the beer remains. You walk the cloister slowly now, the stones familiar underfoot, each one worn smooth by centuries of quiet footsteps and muddy boots. The brewhouse still stands, patched, repaired, reduced, but alive. A few barrels line the back wall. A single copper kettle still hums when the fire's lit. A monk hums softly while stirring the mash, the same melody Brother Anselm used to sing. The world beyond the walls has changed, beyond recognition. The Reformation has come and gone. Empires have risen, fallen, and written books about themselves. Roads are paved. Bottles have labels. Beer is sold in cities by the dozen styles poured cold from polished taps flavoured with citrus or smoked malt. But here, in this quiet cloistered corner of the world, something simpler remains. Mainstream historians often point out that While many monastic breweries were lost, a few endured, and some even thrived. The Trappist order formed after the Reformation took up the brewing tradition again, refining the craft with reverence and patience. Today, Trappist beers are known around the world, not for gimmicks, but for depth, consistency, and the unmistakable mark of sacred time. You sip from a small clay cup. The beer is gentle now, amber smooth, balanced. Less strong than the old Lenten brew, but no less meaningful. It's not about calories anymore. It's about continuity, devotion, memory. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a monastery in Belgium that still uses spring water drawn from the same well as its 17th century predecessors. The monks say it makes the beer taste like history. They might be right. Scholars still debate whether monastic beer has stayed true to its origins or become a well-marketed echo. But sitting here surrounded by stone steam and silence, you don't really care. The point was never perfection. It was presence. You rise one last time and carry your mug to the edge of the courtyard pool where vines twist around a crumbling column. The sky is pale blue. The wind carries the faintest trace of yeast and firewood. And the monastery breathes on, not just as a building, but as a rhythm, a memory, a prayer. And as your eyes grow heavy, the world softens into warmth grain and foam. And now the fire has faded. The last embers glow quietly beneath the kettle, and the mash paddle rests beside the stone wall. The monks have retired to their cells. The brew house has gone still. You sit alone now, wrapped in silence and wool. The scent of barley lingers in the air, just faintly. Not strong enough to pull you back to work. Just enough to carry you forward into sleep. Outside, the wind shifts through the cloister garden. The bells do not ring. There are no more steps to take, no more mugs to fill. Only breath, only warmth. Only the knowledge that you have tasted something real, something rooted in time, in patience, in faith. The beer is gone, but its memory remains on your tongue, soft and slow and golden. Close your eyes. Let the rhythm of prayer and brewing of silence and labour carry you. Let your thoughts settle like the yeast at the bottom of a resting barrel, still quiet at peace. You've journeyed far tonight, through stone halls and smoky kitchens, through the slow boil of mash and the long hush of fasting days. You've stirred the kettle, passed the mug, watched the bubbles rise. You've seen how something as simple as grain and water can become something holy. Now sleep. You've earned it. Let the bells fade. Let the beer rest. And let yourself drift into stillness.